Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 8th installment of our Continental Chop Shop series, wherein we discuss central notions around which conversations in the continental philosophy tradition revolve. Today's theme is the life world, and I think it is crucial during these times, especially to explore the life world, this greater unifying space in which we all inhabit and generate meaning together, and which I believe, as Husserl has believed is over 100 years ago, that the life world and all of its possibilities, all of the humanity that goes into generating meaning and value within this world that is to be for all is not for all. It has been restricted by various powers that be, notions of reason, notion of proper practice, notions of evidence and verification. Many notions of evidence and verification are being thrown out the window, along with rights that secure the possibility for others to meaningfully contribute to this life world and to be recognized for the contributions that every single one of us make in the generation of value, meaning, objective values, and standards of reason that are used to subject us all. Well, maybe not us all, but the bulk of us all. So I'm excited to begin with Husserl. I'll say a little bit on Heidegger. We'll move on to Merleau-Ponty, Giorgi Vachnadze, of Keli, Louvain. We'll jump in with Merleau-Ponty. I'll come back and do some Sartre because Dr. Kimberly Engels had some unexpected travel obligations. We miss her. She will definitely give a better presentation of Sartre than I will outline, but I'll get the basics and we can all fill in. Please do fill in. And then we will turn to Angelia Heredia of Central European University, who will conclude with Fanon, who I'm very excited about because I think he might have the most to say about our current situation and the life world. So without further ado, let me pull up my notes and I'll start in on Husserl. I'm wearing my Husserl t-shirt today. It's giving me power. Let me know, all you all who have participated. If I've yet to send you a Husserl t-shirt, I'll send you one. Okay, so for Husserl, the life world is something pre-given and shared as a backdrop and horizon, really, for our everyday lives, and the meaning generated therein. And on the same token, it is a subjective accomplishment, a model of norms of reason and reasoning, and the ultimate source of evidential verification for science and any other vocational art, as well as the generation of existential humanity itself. While this fact is vehemently and militantly obscured by whatever powers that be, the life world is the world for us all, each and every one of us. This term evolves from Husserl's notion of the Umwelt, which he uses in Ideas 1, which is the surrounding environment. And so we can take this fact literally. The life world is our environment, a shared environment. And I think that aspect of the life world is also crucially important in today's time as we face climate change. But the life world is so much more than our immediate shared and physical material environment, our nature. The life world is the world of our immediate concern, the grounding substratum out of which all possible world life and activity emerges, animated by the rhythmic becoming of meaning, belief systems, norms, activities, higher values, phronesis even, our practical knowledge, and our pure episteme, generated by the downbeats of our individual and collective discernment. I'll first explore how the life world emerges as a subject relative manner for the individual, in Husserl's thought, moving from originary bodily encounters with our spatio-temporal orientation in an environment of material objects, the development of meaning for the individual out of kinesthesis, the I can, and then moving onward to the spiritual intersubjective conditions, occasioning the generation of meaningful life in our shared world, touching on themes of style, the home world, and the alien world. I'll then move to the problem of a science of the life world, getting into Husserl's more technical issues that he has with the naturalistic sciences and their relationship to the life world. That problematic priority that the natural sciences within this dominating vocation, determining the standards of reason, demanding all objective value, bow to its models, representation, practices, and insights will need to address that. So here we go. Now I'll start riffing. The egocentric, as it might be called, emergence is our first orientation within a world of objects. And here we have the development of objective value in the first place. I say first place in quotation marks because Husserl isn't worried about the initial, very first conscious experience of this objective world. A blank slate is nothing that we can truly achieve. We cannot reach back into the recesses of our memory and to know firsthand that first awareness that we have. But what I mean by development of objective value in the first place is this very visceral, perceptual, sensational encounter with this world is what generates objective value. And is that objective value from which the sciences pull whenever they want to imbue an insight of theirs with objective value in a representational manner. So we mean objective value in a very broad, robust sense here. So in the first place, we have, of course, as individuals with our own cogito, our own ego, and intentional directiveness towards this world, motivating the construction of meaningful value out of further sedimentation of fulfilled experiences within this world. So meaning this world comes to us through our sense perception, and through repeated experiences of different sides, different adumbrations of any given object of concern, we begin to generating meaningful relationship with that object, and the object as an object becomes as such through those encounters. The originary visceral encounters are ones of just thingness. We see a pattern. It's vague. It's a thing. But as we come to know it more and more, it develops as an object. And that object which we see becomes transcendent. Beyond that transcendent object, we can see through to the transcendental operations of consciousness, the cogito, what we might call the cogitashio, those acts of consciousness. It's through that relationship that these objects become more meaningful when we see through them. So that's a main motivation for Husserl, to understand the motivations, the subjective motivations of our acts of consciousness, for apprehending these objects as we do, for apprehending them as objects in the first place. And as we do so, as we build meaningful connections through memory, maybe imaginings, our eidetic intuition, where we're building notions of essences and categories and the like, geometrical models of this world around us. We begin to have fulfilled expectations. The life world is a world horizon of possible worldly expectations. And the more that our expectations of an object is fulfilled, the more familiar we become, that we get with it. And as we get more familiar with the objects around us, we become more familiar with the surrounding environment in which we find those objects. So we build a horizon of expectations, even on that very individual, visceral level. So our encounters also are imbued with meaning and through kinesthesis, the I can. Our encounters with objects become saturated, of course, with meaning, animated by our memories, imaginings, our practical goals that we set, the means by which we will achieve them, and this I can. This world of objects is very empowering. It might be misleading for our egos, but I can walk around this object and maybe see it comprehensively as an object. I can drink from it. I can ruin my computer by pouring the water all over it. I can hit somebody with it. There are so many things I could do with this water bottle. And the I can generates another layer of understanding that we have with this world, generating our concept with this world. It's here where we see the world as something we can manipulate. And we do have the will and the volition to do that. So kinesthesis, our very rhythmic and maybe even manipulative, not necessarily in a bad way, although there could be a bad sort of manipulation, our capacity to create a world for ourselves. So what can I do with this world? Through the I can, we also understand ourselves as worldly beings, again, imbued with a sense of agency and volition. So within this life world, we're not just discovering this world of objects and assigning meanings to it. No, we are generating a sense of self through objects that are self-posing, especially on that visceral level. The further stratified we become from that visceral level, the more these objects become solidified in how they appear. But in that visceral level, we understand ourselves and the self-posing object, the distinction between what the object brings to the table and the intentional relationship between subject and object. So while we, yes, are animating this world around us with our values, what we can do with it as individuals even, the world itself does have something to say. And that will be important for Husserl and his project of solidifying the life world as the ultimate space of verification of the generation of our standards of norm and reason, so that we can tell the difference between a hallucination and an objective sense. Transcendent objects are always generated out of objects of sense. Quasi-transcendental objects will come about through imaginings and the like. So again, the structures of objectivity and the understanding of the subjective acts, the accomplishments of creating this world of objectivity as we know it, is something that the life world provides a sense of ourselves. So here, with this I can, this understanding of ourselves and the relationship to this world, how it animates and inspires and motivates us, but also how we animate and shape it, we develop a personalistic attitude, a style, a character even. Each one of us, we're operating in our own little sphere. We're all fixed in this shared world. Fixed in our own perceptual now, are experiencing this world through our own time. Of course, we generate an objective time, a shared objective time, which is also part of this life world. But we're all experiencing that time differently. We're in our own little life worlds, as we might capitulate it. So this personal attitude, this style, this character, that is still something public and something shared, but it's something that we develop out of our very, unique and personal and private encounters with this world and the development of objective meaning and value for ourselves. So, of course, I've got a style through the activities that that I am engaged with. I am identified as a drummer almost immediately everywhere I go. I could be academic AF out here, being nerdy and going on and on and on about my special interests. But I could just be walking out and I can't tell you how many people go, "Hey, are you a musician?" Like, "Oh yeah, I play drums." Like I could tell. So my style of being in this world is generated by my interaction with this world, what my interests are, what my vocation is. I have a walk, I have a talk, I have a swagger. And sometimes in academic settings, it gets me in trouble because you're supposed to be humble and I've got an attitude. But others in the same way, whatever your interests might be, you develop your own style, your own rhythm, your own uh, perceptual process here. But as soon as we start to talk about style, we are immediately confronted with the greater social environment out of which we're developing this style. I didn't invent drumming. There's a whole tradition and history around it, a whole community. Um, what does it mean to be a good drummer? Well, I didn't come up with that by myself. I had a drum tutor. I went through the music programs in high school and middle school, and I've been in so many bands. I practiced my rudiments, and I know all the things that one ought to do here, the things that one ought to do to be a good drummer. The feeling I get whenever the audience enjoys what I'm doing, and that makes me go, "Oh yes, this is good." These values that I use to understand myself, my world, and develop my style are inherited and actively generated in this moment with others. Um, the style, shared values, language through which the individual comes to understand the objects around them, and as such and such, this intersubjective constitution of the life world and its shaping comes into play. Now, our intersubjective life is a transcendental distinction that Husserl makes. We don't even need to reference the life world in order to understand that we are all monads or cogitos or egos, among others, who are equally capable of generating value in this life world and who are all on their parallel spheres of time consciousness. And we sort of polyrhythmically create, even at the transcendental a priori level, a condition for shared meaning here. But it is an examination of intersubjectivity within the life world that brings the interrelations of monads to concrete life and how we might understand the streamlined connection between the a priori transcendental and the concrete life, how it leads to a sort of absolute episteme, at least in an adequate sense. Try not to go off on that tangent. So just as we individuals build our own styles and characters, we do so as a community, localities, and even nations. We build culture, a home world of norms, of oughts and nots. And it's here that the human world becomes familiar to us. It's precisely this world that we take for granted in the natural attitude. So this natural attitude is our typical take of ourselves in the world. It's practically driven. We have means, we have ends, we're interacting with each other. And those means and ends might be vocational, but it might also mean, oh my goodness, I'm about to have a fight with my family. Let me strategize on the best way to go about harmonizing this issue, or blowing it up. If you're trying to burn a bridge, grab a blowtorch. I'm down for that as well. But this everyday life where we are just taking this world for granted as it is, the institutions we were reared in sort of give us this milieu, this intellectual background that we're not thinking about as we go about our everyday life. But since they are there in the background, of our awe perception. It's shaping how we perceive the world. It's motivating our actions within this world, the decisions we make, the conclusions we come to, and all of that. So this natural attitude, within this natural attitude, we take the life world for granted. Not necessarily a bad thing, uh, because that's how we just reshape our home world. It's natural. It's fine. However, in any hyper individualized culture, I wouldn't name one in particular. Our shared accomplishments are all but erased once one has enough money to escape the hellscape that is generated from the life world of possibilities, where things could be given any other way than they are. Why in the actual fuck we do the things the way that we do, I have no idea. Now more than ever, I do not feel at home in my home world. We need Husserl. We need to uncover this life world because we need to discover other ways that we could be in this world and could relate to each other. Ah! But onward to the practices of science. The natural attitude, of course, is the attitude toward this world and ourselves that we typically take, the way that we comport ourselves to the world and ourselves within it. I put within it in quotes because the life world is for Husserl an open horizon of possibility, not some sort of container pot with a lid, all us crabs fighting to get out of it. The life world, it involves, or our natural attitude within the life world involves our practical goings on, wherein we set our ends and concoct our means of achieving those ends. We're not deeply reflecting on our motivations for setting the ends which we do or choosing the means that we do in the natural attitude. And if you're a proper Kantian, by the way, you can see how room for radical evil to emerge is conditioned by the natural attitude because it is pre-reflective. The life world is taken for granted as something for us to use and manipulate, again, which isn't necessarily bad until we get caught up and run away with what he calls the naturalistic attitude. The naturalistic attitude is the attitude that the natural sciences have taken on. And it's formed by this combination of formal ontology, this realm of being for mathematical numbers and figures, geometrical figures, theories and essences, which Husserl will want to access, and our naive way of looking at things, that I can look at this book and understand its dimensions. I can know it comprehensively, at least in its objective value. Since Galileo, according to Husserl, nature has become mathematized, and we can explore this world, this life world, as in an exhaustible manner. So we have this combination of the pre-reflective natural attitude and the assumptions that come with it, including the I can, caught up with this formal ontology that, is so neutral, it can't be wrong. And we develop the scientific theory that we have today. However, as we develop that theory, the scientific method, of course, we are generating an understanding of ourselves. This life world, again, presents a place for us to develop an understanding of the world itself, but ourselves within it. And we get these notions of reason, of pure reason, even the mythical constructions of Kant, as Husserl calls it, that we can set aside our merely subjective aspects of our cognition, of our reason. Let's forget the axiological sphere of our reason. We will just focus on the purely speculative and theoretical, and to create a pure practice of science that will yield true objective knowledge of this world. But Husserl will say, as we cut off the merely subjective aspects of our life, we are cutting off the original channel through which we receive evidence to begin with, how on earth are we to justify and validate the conclusions we come to without those merely subjective experiences? And how are we to reflect on the anonymous motivations that seep into the conclusions that we make? My other presentations will be shorter, so I'm sorry for going on, but it's story time for Husserl. For example, I have ulcerative colitis. I'm in a flare-up right now. Again, I'm not about to die or need to have my colon removed, but it's a pretty bad flare-up. Recently, I had gotten a new GP. She was going on about my history and this and that. We started with the mental health side of things, and I was listing the diagnoses and the pills I was on, and she goes, "Well, that's a list." I did not like that tone. I'm like, okay, whatever. And I said, well, I also have ADHD. It's kind of bad. I call it drummer brain. But I can't take medication for it because I have these heinous stomach issues. And that's all I said, heinous stomach issues. So she starts going on about, okay, what about the physical history? What's going on with your stomach? I said, well, it started off in undergrad, my junior year. I just would start having these stomach attacks. Not to get too graphic, trigger warning, bodily fluids. I just diarrhea, constant throwing up. My body would seize up. I can't move. I have to go to the hospital. They pump me up with fluids, give me an Ativan, maybe some pain pills, and then send me on my way. Now, those experiences in the ER are traumatic because, skinny, malnourished looking me with a mohawk, they're thinking, oh, she's just trying to get pills. So they sit there and let me suffer for a while until the nausea pills or whatever they're pumping up into me are clearly not working, and then they believe me. It's like, why are your judgments about the way I look coming into your medical diagnoses and the care that I'm receiving, or the lack of care that I'm receiving? So this has been a problem in my life, and something I'm very passionate about using Husserl to illuminate. So she stopped me there, and she's like, well, she asked me before, do you drink or smoke weed? I don't drink, but do smoke weed. It helps with the stomach problem. She's like, well, that's it. That's what's causing the throwing up. And then she starts to list the symptoms of a Pepto-Bismol commercial. Smoking weed can cause, upset stomach, diarrhea, indigestion, whatever else. And I stopped her and I said, well, actually, it's ulcerative colitis. That woman's face, she was angry. She goes, oh, okay. I'm like, what experience am I having right now? This is absurd. So I started walking her through the history and what it took to get diagnosed. And she kept interrupting me. And she said, nobody said anything about the weed. And I'm like, you bitch. I have a GI at this point. I have an official diagnosis. Smoking weed does not cause your bowels to bleed or for the mucus to become ulcerated. I don't want to make judgments, but she had a big old cross on her neck. What sort of biases from the greater life world were seeping into her medical practice because she believed herself to be able to set aside those merely subjective aspects of herself and use her authority as a doctor to come to this diagnosis? I get nothing but abused. I have stories upon stories upon stories. I will save them for the medical science class that's ongoing, and put that on the YouTube. But the concern about the mythical construction of reason, our capacity to ignore the subjective relative aspects of our life world and the greater religious and other institutions, all those influences that are operating in the background of our perception always. Nothing against Christianity in general. I no longer am a practicer. My grandfather was a preacher, and I got enough of that. But I do appreciate all religions, so I could be making assumptions too about that cross. But this is the way that the naturalistic attitude hides hides the anonymous accomplishments of science and those who are practicing it. And I'm not the only one that has problems like this. Think about the history of women's health and how, especially in the mental health field, you being mad at your man constitutes hysteria, and there you end up in the asylum. Why is it that homosexuality took as long as it did to be removed from the DSM uh, as a mental illness? It is because religious values were coming into play, even in this new, very scientific psychology where we are being neutral and mathematic and reducing things to physical explanations. Ah, goodness. Where are my notes? I got swept away. Okay, so the goal of any science, according to Husserl, is to produce episteme, a true higher knowledge that we can then apply to our humanity within this life world. Because this life world, even though we can make a home for ourselves, a home world that we understand, in terms of our norms and our practices, in which we might set against as an alien world when we encounter a culture that we don't understand, we should be able to use that science to illuminate the greater problems of our humanity, why we're here, how we ought to act, how we ought to interact with other cultures, other alien worlds. You know, what to do with the practical knowledge that we generate with this phronesis. To the true science, true knowledge, whether it be pure or just adequate, should illuminate this life world and illuminate the possibilities therein, and to generate curiosity, not bigotedness, not closed offness. It should generate radical, rational empathy. So we generate this pure episteme through scientific practices, generating, of course, also practical knowledge. Husserl wants to say, however, that the naturalistic attitude can never truly produce true episteme, true knowledge. To be a full-fledged science on its own, as its models, standards, practices, and discoveries choke off the greater pool of meaning generated within the life world, obscuring the subjective accomplishment that is the world of the natural science in the first place. The life world within the naturalistic sciences have strict notions of reason, evidence, reality, and verification that leave no room for other accounts of the origin of objective measure. They take their method to be the ultimate source of verification and not the greater life world. And here we find scientists unable to reflect upon their own motivations and their pure conclusions. Story about the recent GP. When we lose out on the greater possibilities of the life world and the anonymous motivations generating the conclusions we come to, we could very well lose our humanity. Humanity is something we must practice if it is to remain a possibility in this life world, and we need a science that is philosophy, of course, his phenomenology, to reveal this greater life world. So we have hope of a possible science of the life world, according to Husserl. It'll free it from the shackles of the naturalistic stranglehold, and free us and our minds in the same token. That science, his phenomenology, of course, will be logical yet descriptive, because according to Husserl, to deduce is not to explain. He doesn't want to even explain, because at the deepest level of our cognition, in the realm of inner phenomenological time consciousness, what we see are patterns. And to explain them is to take ourselves away from that immediate sphere. So through time consciousness, and strict practice of his epoche, we might have a descriptive science of the life world. It will be quite the dance, bringing that science to fruition, as the life world is something pre-reflective and taken for granted. As soon as we take on a theoretical attitude towards it, we've removed ourselves from the immediacy of the life world, impacting what we see by measuring it. I have thoughts on how we can overcome that. I'd like to save some of that for next summer for the journal that we will putting out, but I am open to questions about that science and how it might be done. And if I have to reveal my secret sauce, then I'll reveal my secret sauce. So before I move on to Heidegger and all the chastising I might do, Any questions on Husserl and the life world? Or comments, questions, comments, concerns?
I do have a question. Um, so with Husserl, would you say that the life world is a obviously a central thematic with Husserl, but it's not ontologically as foundational as the subject and the transcendental ego, right? Because fundamentally, it's the ego that constitutes the life world, right? And the body.
Yeah, yes. In the yes and no. The life world is ontologically necessary in order for the the cognition to arise in the first place. So without a world of objects there would not be that intentional relationship. However, we can suspend our judgments about the world. We can suspend our judgments about the existence of the world altogether and understand that intentional relationship. So, in that sense, yes, the life world is not as ontologically foundational as our intentional relationship to any object whatsoever, which could be something imaginative, not necessarily real. Within this world of inner phenomenological consciousness, after we've taken on the epoche, we've taken on the attitude of the as if. We could take on a possible world. We don't need to reference the life world. Um, we could just reference any object whatsoever. Uh, and again, in that innermost recess of time consciousness, we don't see a world, we don't see objects, we just see patterns. Yeah, good question. Great question. Any others? Okay. If they come up and we need to come back to it later, that's fine. Let's move on to Heidegger. I have so many thoughts. Heidegger does not really implement the term life world often, if at all. I am not sure because I have not read him as comprehensively as I've read my Husserl. I try to stay away from Heidegger as far as possible. But his notion of being in the world and being with the world lead to something akin to a world life that is akin to, and I would say completely stolen from, Husserl's notion of the life world. I'm going to get in trouble with all the Heidegger fans. Of course, we've covered Heidegger's notion of Dasein, or greater human existence within the facticity of our world, um, in past chop shops, but we'll do a little review. He claims that this Dasein runs deeper than the outdated notion of a transcendental subjectivity with the limitations and connotations that come with the cogito. That itself is a construction, and perhaps a mythical construction. Husserl is over here accusing Kant of creating mythical constructions of pure reason, but perhaps the cogito is one too. You know what, Heidegger, you may have a point there. Uh, I think he falls right back into the notion of subjectivity when you really look at his notion of care, fallenness, authenticity, a clearing, and homeness. Um, but then again, I think that's just because he stole the bulk of his philosophy from Husserl, all while writing in personal letters that he would strangle the old man's neck. So I do think that he is right in saying that this cogito is something that is a model, and the notion of intentionality, the cogitatio cogitatum of Husserl, yeah, that is a construction, one that Husserl will say is very authentic. But if you take Husserl's philosophy seriously, things could be given any other way. We could understand our understanding any other way. So Heidegger does pick up on that, and that is why we should still study him, even though he is a Nazi scum. enough of my rage. Dasein has its various manners of comporting itself towards the world. And those notions, despite my hatred of Heidegger, really do require inspection, as they do bring a more earthy account of humanity and what it is we do with our lives here in this world. So this world, first and foremost, is spatially available for Dasein. This availability is something that Dasein creates for itself, especially in terms of what Dasein can do with the spatially surrounding world. In a very practical sense, the world is there for our making. And technology arises from this comportment as we pursue our interests. Take drumming, for example. The metronome was not always there. Drumming's been around for thousands of years, but in order to take it to the next level and be the sickest drummers we can be, get out that metronome. Use technology. And the metronome itself has evolved, and just go ahead and make use for it. Now, there's a bad side, of course, to that technology. Unrestrained pursuit of our interest in this world for our own sake, and creating technology to support our ends. Are those ends good ends, or are they ruining the environment? Are they blowing up children? I don't know. But the very concern that Dasein has with this world is first and foremost practically motivated. And it is our individual instances that comport the greater human existence in the directions it goes in. There are three elements that co-constitute being in the world: disposedness, understanding, and discourse. And these elements, I believe, lead to his hermeneutics, because it will involve language and interpretation. So these elements are equiprimordial, conditioning familiarity with the world, meaning that they are equally fundamental and codependent on one another as we clear a way for a home for ourselves here. For example, disposedness is our general openness towards the world in the first place, and it involves affect, our being open to this world and this or that emotional color or mood, if you will. And our understanding of the world is conditioned by mood, or perhaps might change our mood and lead to further openness to the world. So they're all intermingled and changing each other, perhaps. So understanding will have its mood, as will communication, our use of language and understanding of the world, occasioning our interpretation based on our primary understanding of the world. And in certain moods, we need to do the work of clearing a way towards a new understanding of the world that won't lead to you being a harm to yourself and or others. Maybe Heidegger should have been locked up on the 5th floor of St. Mary's, being shot up with Ativan instead of me. I don't know. I'm just kidding. No, it is work sometimes to get yourself out of a mood. Where was I? Okay, so communication. Yes, mood and communication. I have a silly example that I share with my students, and it's based on the movie Mean Girls. I love that movie. I do not know why. It brings me such great pleasure. But Regina George and the way that she compliments people, there's a huge difference between saying, "Oh my God, I love your top," and "Oh my God, I love your top." So same grammar, but the use of that language, how it is we're communicating, is imbued with affect. So that's important. He doesn't really go into the importance of material bodies for the emergence of the world as something we can manipulate, and as a source of visceral orientation with the world around us and with others. But I think that's because if he said that, then he would have to recognize all human bodies as human bodies, capable of constituting space and its value for us. If we were to do that, we'd have a hard time being complicit with the subjugation and torture of human bodies that don't look like us or don't believe the same things we do, and the complete degradation of humanity as he was. Shame on Heidegger for all of time. I know I'm supposed to be impartial, but times like these, I can't. My big fat mouth, it's been running. So onward. As part of our world life, we are beings with others. The other puts a demand on us, requires us to act or react. And we must be on the ready to respond to those demands. In the practical sphere of our affairs, we generate social norms of how one ought to be in this world. Those norms help us to escape the pressures of angst stemming from our responsibility for what we create. Das Man, or the anyone, allows for the anonymous accomplishments that Husserl mentions. What would one do in this social situation? We get caught up in idle chit chat when we get caught up in this anyone, what we ought to do. We become more and more alienated from that original Dasein, our capacity to create for ourselves a home how we might like it. And this idle chit chat, it covers over what's the deeper machinations, perhaps, of Dasein. So we get caught up in this idle chatter. We generate further further alienating us from our original Dasein, our human existence in this world. And it is only with encounters with death that we remember ourselves, the ownership of our values, the limited time that we have here, and that we must make of this life what we will, and the power we have to live authentically in this world with others. I recently experienced this. I still am not over it, but the death of my beloved Mr. Roman. I sometimes love dogs more than people. Not you people, just people in general. Individual people I love with all my heart, but people, dogs I love. And when he died, oh my God, I was in this terrible state of grief and so sensitive. I felt like I could feel every little thing. And what was revealed to me were immediately the patterns of my behavior that were holding me back. Certain people that maybe didn't have my best interest at heart, but I didn't see it before because we were just engaged in idle chit chat. How do I cut these people off, or how do I set different boundaries? The way that I exist in this world radically changed because of the death of my beloved Mr. Roman. Um, so I follow Heidegger to that point. I agree with him there. However, I pose this question to him. I'd like to know just how much death we need to encounter before we say, hey, this is enough death for us to start considering being responsible for being swept away in what one ought to do. One ought to just take orders. Heidegger's out here having me agree with Sartre, that titty baby mama's little Socrates who thinks he's above frigid women and the waitress. All my rage is coming out. But I would agree with Sartre's take on this. Well, it's the anonymous. It's just what one does, and oops, we got stratified, and oops, we might have committed genocide. But now we can reflect and become more authentic. Oops, bye. So mad. I'm so mad. In any event, it is through communication with each other that we generate this shared world. Communication, again, doesn't need to mean something strictly linguistic, and it need not always lead to moral demands. Of course, we can have body language. Sartre talks about the look, the gaze, and I just can't help but think about the teacher look that I have developed. It just takes one look. I have this one drum student I've had for a while, and I just looked at her hand, didn't even say anything, and she adjusted it as she knew. She knew what I was going to say. So communication doesn't need to be linguistic, but it also doesn't need to lead to moral demand. The moral demand of the other in Heidegger is not like one we find in Kierkegaard or Levinas. For Heidegger, the face of the other, as Levinas puts it, puts a call upon our conscience that has no content. As he writes in Being and Time, the call asserts nothing, gives no information about world events, has nothing to tell. And I think that tells us all we need to know about Heidegger. So that was very unneutral uh, don't get me wrong, I've got problems with Husserl, and I'm very vocal about them, but I do love that man dearly, and had such a positive impact on my life. Um, uh, you know, I don't look over what he's done, especially talking about his notions of historicity and some certain things he mentions in the crisis, but his overall philosophy is one that emphasizes empathy and the renewal of the life world and of being open to other worlds within this one unifying life world. Other when we say many worlds, it's all unified by one backdrop of the life world. Husserl promotes that empathy, that radical, rational empathy, as I call it. Heidegger, on the other hand, while I do agree with some things that he says, and while I do agree he's important to study because of his impact and contribution to the continental tradition, I, especially on this day in 2025, have feelings. I have big feelings. Okay, so that's all I have to say about Heidegger. If anybody has questions or comments, um, I open the floor to them.
Looks like it's going to be me again. Um, so I'm really interested in how you would do like a short comparison between like, so how is the Dasein different from the transcendental ego, right? So how is the Heideggerian subject, or maybe not so subject, similar or different from the Husserlian subject?
You know what? I anticipated this question coming up, and I've got such a problem with a footnote on page 5 in section 2 of Husserl's Crisis, because Husserl means human existence, and in the German he writes menschliches Dasein. And the translator writes, Husserl makes rather extensive use in this work of the word Dasein as applied specifically to man's existence. This is probably a conscious or unconscious concession to the popularity of Heidegger's work. His use of the term existenz will be noted below. I don't like that the translator used the term concession. What I think was happening is that Husserl had this notion since ideas too, and the term Dasein became popular, so he implemented it so that people would know what he was referencing. So I think what Heidegger is attempting to do is say that humanity itself has a greater being that need not be tied to a concept of subjectivity that is opposed to an object, and that there is some sort of intentional relationship there. Dasein can comport itself in a way as to construe humanity in that manner, but we could speak of ourselves, comport ourselves in a different way. Now, I get where he's going with that. However, uh, an important part of Dasein is being in this world. We don't know Dasein any other way than through our human existence, and Dasein is directed by care. Our attention is directed by care. What is it that we pay attention to? Our motivations, our desires, our interests, our traumas, maybe, and our memories, our imaginings, all of that. That's instituting our care. And I don't see much of a difference between that and subjectivity, an intentional subjectivity that is a human being directed towards a world of objects. Now, Husserl is caught up in his scientific project, and he is trying to form, with his notion of intentionality, a position where we can bring in a little bit of realism and still account for the subjective constitution or accomplishments within this world and the constitution of a meaningful relationship with these world of objects. It's this intentional foundation that allows for higher ordered meaning to generate. And without that intentional structure, we fall prey to being unable to distinguish our contribution of evidence versus the world's contribution of evidence. So while Heidegger is correct that we need not formulate humanity in such a way, if we are going to put a check on the sciences, we must, I think, make that distinction. And I do see Husserl's notion of intentionality operating in Heidegger's notion of care. I would say that though, because I'm angry at Heidegger, and I think he stole a good chunk, not everything, but a good chunk from Husserl, and then was nasty to him and didn't show up to his funeral after wringing his neck in a metaphorical way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, yes, yes. Great question. Great question. And I'm glad that you asked it because I was prepared to go on that rant. I had the quote and everything. Any other questions or concerns? Revelations of how we feel.
Maybe I had a question about coming back to Husserl. Maybe I missed it, but maybe if you could say more about why to use the notion of life. Like, what does life mean in the concept of life world? What do we mean by life? Or
Yes, life is um, something animating. Now, of course, Husserl will have this concept of life that we generate out of our living. He really gets into this notion of life and ideas too, where he talks about the spirit realm. His first chapter talks about the the way that the material world emerges for the individual. We get into the I can, and here's where our system or our belief system about our volition comes into play. But Husserl wants us to suspend the personalistic attitude that develops out of our everyday lives, our goings about pre-reflectively just doing our thing, that level of life. Whenever we suspend our personalistic attitude, which is the way we understand ourselves, the our style, our character, but our attitude, maybe in a bad way, the imposter syndrome that we have that might be built into our personalistic attitude, how we think about ourselves. But maybe we think very highly of ourselves. Maybe we go back and forth between the two. So this personalistic attitude is how we typically think about ourselves. And Husserl wants to say that typically there is this concept of volition and will there. But once we suspend that personalistic attitude or the judgments that we make based on that, we see that, oh dear, we might not be in control of our bodies as much as we realize, or in terms of our actions and our motivations. He'll say that, we're animated by this spirit realm, which doesn't necessarily mean religious spirit, although that's involved. It's our Geist, our social realm. So, our decisions, our belief systems that also go into the construction of our self-identity is animated by these norms and structures. So life is still happening. Life is animated through these strictures, I guess. So we have natural life, we have animation on the level of animalia. I love when he gets to that part because, well, that's my nickname, Keli Animal Birchfield. Within this animalistic place, we have the capacity to be animated by our cognition, to be animated by our social space, our home world, any encounters we might have with the alien world. So we could think about life in a few ways. He doesn't succumb to a sort of vitalism. I think that might skirt too closely to animism, and Husserl wants to say that we can take a scientific approach to understand the life world more fully. But life itself involves just the animations around us, the animations of nature that we perceive passively, the judgments that we make through passive reception actively, life and what it means to us. That's something that we cultivate together and individually. So he would say that life has different meanings. So we would want to look at the essence of life. What is life, and what are the different modes of givenness? So life is given to us pre-reflectively. We're just living, and that is the life. We could say we're living the life. That means something different. That means, oh, I've got money. Or you could be sarcastic, I'm living the dream, I'm living the life, and maybe that means something not so great. We can point to life as something precious, as something that should be secured. We could look to life as something that that inherently contains innate human rights or animal rights. You know, the life itself allows us to speak about life in all of these different ways. So there are different modes of givenness, and it is in the spirit realm that we see all of these different animations going through us, speaking through us as mediums, and almost taking on a life of its own. That sort of life that speaks through us as a medium, I think is the most fun for me. His definition of life as an artist. I feel like we can get really Nietzsche in there and ideas too, man as medium. But life is always speaking through us, and we are always contributing to life. And life is given through so many different modes. I hope that was helpful.
It was very helpful. Thank you.
I get so excited. I'm like, I can't tell if that was a ramble.
No, it was a great answer. Like, yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. Georgie says he'll be right back. Oh,
I'm back.
Oh, Georgie's back. Okay. Are we ready to move on to Merleau-Ponty?
Absolutely, yes.
All right. Take it away.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So, yes, my name is Giorgi Vachnadze. I'll be talking about Merleau-Ponty's conception of the life world. And so, yeah, when I was beginning my investigation, going back to Merleau-Ponty, as Keli said, we're already working on a project here for I'm doing an article for the Launchpad Philosophy Foundation on Merleau-Ponty and rhythm. So it wasn't new territory, but focusing on the life world revealed a lot of new things about Merleau-Ponty that I did not previously know or realize. So as I was looking into the literature, and as I was reading one of my favorite books by Merleau-Ponty, is actually not the Phenomenology of Perception, though that is the most important one. I think my favorite one right now is The Prose of the World. The book is called The Prose of the World, and it contains specifically Merleau-Ponty's reflections on language. And I'm going to go back to that because language is one of the primary axes of Merleau-Ponty's ontology that I want to discuss. He calls it the axis of expression, right? He doesn't say language. He says language, obviously, but he emphasizes its expressive function. Now, as I was reading through the book, I saw a chapter that I found enticing just based on the title, and I decided to organize my whole talk around. So this would be the central, so to speak, motif, the central text, which is at the center of how I'm going to discuss Merleau-Ponty's life world. So before I continue, one of the personal reasons I love the book, The Prose of the World, is because Foucault has an explicit reference to that text, a hidden reference, which is typical of Foucault, because one of his chapters in the order of things is just called that. It's just called The Prose of the World. And that is an obvious reference to a book written by Merleau-Ponty. I am mostly a Foucault scholar, Foucault-Wittgenstein scholar, but Foucault was deeply influenced by Merleau-Ponty. And when I wrote my book on Foucault, AI, and Christianity, I did not know that I was also indirectly writing about Merleau-Ponty's conception of the flesh, which is also going to be a central concept here. Keli, when you were talking about aliens and this idea or the impossibility of a universal language, it reminded me of another review article I wrote for a friend of mine who's a digital artist, and he has very interesting installations. He's called Ian Margot. And in one of the texts that he wrote, he talked about NASA's Pioneer Plaque project. Have you heard about this one? It's when NASA came up with this universal, quote unquote, pictogram that they could encode human language and culture into and then send that into outer space for aliens to be able to decipher it, right? And so his critique and my critique, which is linked to Merleau-Ponty's critique of rationality, is this critique of this idea that there's such a thing as a universal language. And the question of the impossibility of a purely rational universal language is precisely one of the main topics of this chapter from the Prose of the World that I found enticing. Especially because I write about AI. I like to write critical pieces, biopolitics of AI, stuff like that. And this chapter from the Prose of the World is called Algorithm and the Mystery of Language, right? And so immediately I became very interested in this, right? Because this opened up the avenue to how I'm going to position my talk. And I'm going to position my talk in terms of Merleau-Ponty's Lifeworld versus the computational life world, right? Because today we see these attempts of reducing everything to the binary logic of logic gates and cybernetics and digital technology, right? This idea that the human brain is structured like a computer and all this nonsense, right? These worn out metaphors that aren't even used in science anymore. I think scientists have new metaphors now, better metaphors, at least those that are at the front of science, right? So this is my rage. This is my own angry rant here, right? To counterbalance Keli's, right? We are not structured like computers, okay? Get over it. So I'd like to open with a quote here. This is from an unpublished text by Merleau-Ponty, where he's talking about his first book called The Structure of Behavior, right? And so he says, when one attempts, as I have in The Structure of Behavior, to trace out on the basis of modern psychology and physiology, the relationships that obtain between the perceiving organism and its milieu, so its life world, right, its surroundings, one clearly finds that they are not those of an automatic machine which needs an outside agent to set off its pre-established mechanisms. Okay, so this is a critique of Cartesian reason, right? And a lot of Merleau-Ponty and also most of Heidegger, right? And this is where I want to draw the contrast between Husserl on the one hand and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty on the other, right? There is an explicit anti-Cartesianism in Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger. Okay, they are simply not Cartesians, right? So I think that's a very important distinction to draw. Okay, so now I'll start reading over my script. So in an era increasingly orchestrated by computation, we're compelled to ask whether the life world, the realm of pre-reflective and, for Merleau-Ponty, embodied experience, can itself be rendered algorithmic. That is, can perception, expression, and historical becoming be reduced to data structures, formal operations, and predictive outputs? Can the thickness of lived meaning be flattened into the transparency of code? Of course, the answer is no, and Merleau-Ponty's answer is no. Now, to trace the conceptual map of my talk, right? So I will discuss Merleau-Ponty's notion of the life world along three main axes: ontological axis, or in our case, the three axes of resistance, right? The resistance to reductionism, not just computational or scientific reductionism, but dogmatic reductionism, religious reductionism, or today, fascist Nazi reductionism, right? The reduction of everything to binaries, right? You're a man or you're a woman or whatever, right? So all of these ideological reductionisms, but most interestingly for me, algorithmic and scientific forms of reductionism. So the three axes are first the body as resistance to computationalism, expression or the opacity of language. There's an inherent opacity to language which is ontologically necessary. And third, institution and the history of meaning, right? So with Merleau-Ponty, just like with Heidegger, we unfold within a temporality. So we do not have essences. We do not have universal eidetic structures that need to be uncovered through a detachment or some sort of passive observation, right? So Merleau-Ponty's ontology is very active. In fact, for him, being in the world means interacting with the world. You can never have a detached attitude towards the world without falling into some kind of problematic solipsism or skepticism. So Merleau-Ponty portrays Lifeworld as a style, and we have a similar sentiment as Husserl, I just found out from Keli. Merleau-Ponty's notion of the life world is not merely a phenomenological background, but the very structure of perceptual emergence. It is neither an object nor a subject, but a field of co-orientation. The life world is where things become intelligible before they are categorized, where bodies find their posture before they make decisions. Now, Merleau-Ponty's primary thesis is called the primacy of perception. And the idea is quite simple. Perception is, it predates everything else. Perception is ontologically prior. It's not, so the problem of perception, first of all, when he talks about perception, he does not mean this in an intellectualist or a Cartesian sense, when there's a pure subject or a pure ego observing object. So Merleau-Ponty wants to get rid of the subject-object distinction completely. And that's why I love this ontology, because it's something you hear very rarely. In fact, it's almost postmodern, I would say. And so his lifelong project is getting rid of dualisms. So not just subject-object dualisms. And he's not a holist either, which is interesting. Merleau-Ponty is neither a holist nor a dualist. But he does tackle explicitly dualist ontologies, be it Cartesian, be it subject-object division, be it transcendent versus immanent ontologies. And of course, the most famous one, if you've read any Merleau-Ponty at all, it's intellectualist versus empiricist. Now, if we do not have a subject and an object in a world, then what do we have? Well, we have a body, but it's not a body, it's always multiple bodies. And the distinction between one body and the other is never actually clear. So there is not a clear boundary, even at the corporeal level, between I and the other. So for Merleau-Ponty, the outside world is not something that the subject is confronted by, but it is the very precondition for the emergence of subjectivity in the first place. And so in this way, I think, or we could say that out of all the other phenomenologies that we're going to cover, the life world for Merleau-Ponty is not just important or central, it is foundational, right? So the subject and the object emerge out of very complex processes that the life world undergoes through experience. And the way Merleau-Ponty reconciles the fact that there is still a difference between me and the table, between me and another person, there's still some distance, right? Otherwise, I won't be able to speak or act meaningfully in the world. There has to be some sort of distinction. And what is this distinction? Well, it's what he calls chiasm, right? So the structure is chiasmatic. And the fact that the structure is chiasmatic is very important, because a chiasmatic difference does not imply a strict distinction. And it's fundamentally, at least according to Merleau-Ponty, more reconcilable than the Husserlian distinction between noesis and noema. It's more reconcilable than the Sartrean distinction between being and nothingness, right? Or the consciousness and the things it observes in the world, right? And the fundamental feature of a chiasmatic relation is the property, so to speak, of reversibility. So I have a reversible relationship between myself and the things I interact with in the world. When I touch something, it is also being touched by me. When I see something, it is also seen. I am seen and seer at the same time. So there's a regime of reversible visibilities within Merleau-Ponty's ontology, and this gets quite complex. We're going to come back to this again, because he talks about some very interesting stuff. Like when the artist says, he brings an example of an artist. He goes into the forest. He wants to draw a landscape, and he says, as I was looking at the trees and trying to represent them, to paint them, I felt the trees were also looking at me. He says the trees were seeing me, right? And Merleau-Ponty says this is not just an example of artistic extravagance. He's not just insane. There's something to this. But before we continue, let's talk about the body a little more. So Merleau-Ponty's body is not an empirical body, right? So this is not, he's not reverting back to naturalism, right? This is important, right? Both Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, they are critical of empiricism, they're critical of the natural attitude, they're critical of scientific reductionism, but they have fundamentally different approaches of how they go around it, right? So what Merleau-Ponty does, and we can use a metaphor here, is instead of bracketing the natural attitude and the outside world, he reaches beneath it. So this is a metaphor that we can use. Foucault also liked to use this metaphor when he wrote the genealogy. And so the idea of reaching beneath the empirical world is understanding the dynamic nature of how the empirical world comes about in the first place. Maybe it happens through experiment, maybe it happens through phenomenological reflection, but the fundamental operations that take place are artistic. They're corporeal, they're artistic. And here we see parallels with Heidegger as well, because Heidegger was also in favor of a kind of poetic revealing of being, right? With Heidegger, we don't have this Husserlian moment of describing the essences after performing the epoche, or describing phenomenologically the immediate data of consciousness. But we have a kind of letting things be, right? The Gelassenheit. And the idea of the Gelassenheit is that by manipulating language in a creative way, instead of categorizing or ordering language in a scientific manner, we actually invent a new language. We come up with expressions. We introduce pure novelty into the life world, and that allows for new things to emerge, right? So the accent here is not on clarity. The accent here is on novelty, of discovering new things. And this element of novelty is what for Merleau-Ponty constitutes expression, as opposed to instituted language, right? So if we want another bird's eye view of Merleau-Ponty's ontology, we can say it begins with the body and perception. That's where our being is most raw and most uncluttered by language and rational concepts. And as we move from body to expression, this constitutes a movement from the visible to the invisible, right? And his last book is called, his unfinished manuscript is called The Visible and the Invisible. And a lot of scholars argue that is where his ontology becomes most explicit, right? Because if you're going to say that perception and the body is the foundation of all meaning, then the question arises, well, what about concepts? Concepts are inherently abstract. So how do you account for the existence of concepts which you can't see, you can't touch, and so forth? And it gets complicated. I can't pretend to completely understand it, but the way Merleau-Ponty goes about it, he says that the invisible is a kind of emanation, almost like a vapor that emerges from the visible. So our words mimic our bodies, and expression is a kind of residue that falls out of our corporeal life forms, our life world, our forms of life. So language is not like a picture of what it represents, but it is more like an artistic representation, artistic interpretation of something that is very embodied and corporeal, right? And so now this creates a lot of interesting questions, a lot of interesting problems, but also poses some interesting provocations to classical theories of language, especially the referential theory of language, but also the linguistic accounts of language and the history of how language develops. Because today we are dominated by a regime of invisibilities whose embodied origins are completely hidden, right? So this is very important, right? This is where it could get political if you wanted to, right? We are dominated by a regime of signs, of concepts, of ideas, of formal systems and algorithms, which actively hide their own opacity, right? They hide their own flesh. They hide where they come from, the life forms that allowed for their emergence, right? And we can bring a modern example, right? Some company creates an AI and then AI does something bizarre, right? Something denies healthcare to someone, right? Or does something racist or says something, crazy, but not just crazy in the sense of nonsense, right? That's a different problem, but something that is structurally oppressive, right? That's the problem, right? So there's a structure to it, right? It's not that AIs just explode or go on a rampage, right? That's the other end of ideology, right? So we have two opposing containment practices, right? For how we should talk about AI when we talk about AI, right? And usually we have the people who say, "Oh, AI is going to be so brilliant, it's going to take over and going to kill us all," right? So this is one extreme, completely fruitless. Like, right? What is the? How are you contributing to the to the public sphere with a crazy example like that, right? And then on the other hand, we have also the utopian idea of AI is going to fix everything, right? So these are both, I think, harmful to real constructive criticism of what's going on here, because with a better form of criticism, we need to identify the structural forms of oppression that algorithms participate in, right? And this we could do that using Merleau-Ponty's idea of the life world, right? Okay, let's go back a little bit. So the life world is fundamentally the visible, the corporeal, and the perceptible. Now, out of this emanates a kind of chiasmatic self-alienation or self-distancing of the body through expression. And the expression is an artistic reflection of the life form. But then with time, the invisible structures of expression they become congealed, they acquire their own agency, and they may even become detached from a particular life form and then reattached to a different life form, to a different concatenation of bodies and relationships. And if we are unable to trace the initial origin of the new regime of invisibilities to their corporeal origins, we might be fooled that the invisible is pure rationality. And it's important not to be fooled, because that's how we become, that's how we are governed, unfortunately. Now, a very good example of this, I think, is a slang. Because with slang, we see the emergence of invisible from the visible. Because slang is quote unquote primitive, but actually it's not primitive. It's one of the most sophisticated forms of poetic expression, and it captures the essence of language in many ways. Why? Because it's directly tied to what it represents in a non-referential way, right? So if I say, like an analytic philosopher, right? I say a logical proposition. Within the logical proposition, noun stands for objects, right? So I say the word table refers to the table. Table is in front of me, right? It's all nice and neat, but it reveals absolutely nothing about how language operates, because I do not look into the genealogy of the word table, and I do not uncover its archaic roots. And its archaic roots would be identical to the way slang operates today. Because in slang, we see a direct connection, an artistic, again, non-referential, but artistic connection between what is said and what it refers to. Okay, let's bring a stupid example, okay, because I'm horrible at this. So we'll bring a stupid example. You know how sometimes people say it with your chest? Yeah, right? So be confident. Say it with your chest, right? Now, if you use the referential theory of meaning, right, you'd get some sort of horror show, right? Somebody has a mouth in their chest or something, right? That's it's not what it means, right? What it means, it's an artistic depiction, right? It's a poetic depiction that you're supposed to have a certain gesture, a certain orientation with your body when you express yourself in this way. And so Merleau-Ponty says that captures the essence of language better than classical linguistics, better than classical historiography, and definitely better than logic. And I find that to be a very, very important revelation. And to quote a Merleau-Ponty scholar, this is an excellent quote, which I think illustrates precisely what I'm talking about right now. Homo sapiens was not born with a dictionary in his hand. Right? The Homo sapien was not born with a dictionary in his hand. So if you're going to keep going back to the dictionary, well, you're falling victim to an arbitrary regime of visibilities, right? A very old one, a very sophisticated one, right? But that's not, the dictionary doesn't tell me anything about the origins of language, right? So Merleau-Ponty's ontology of language overturns the representational model that sees words as containers of meaning. In the prose of the world, he insists, language is not, first of all, the sign of certain significations, but the rule-governed power of differentiating the verbal chain. That is, language is not a code that transmits preformed thoughts. It is an event, a gesture, a style of perception that becomes visible, right? Now, I would say it becomes invisible because the invisible is what belongs to the order of what is intuitive. So to use Husserl's example of the Abschattungen, right, the adumbrations, when we look at an object, right, and then we see one side of the object, right, perspectively, we just see one side of the object. We don't see the other side of the object, but there's something in us that tells us what the other side looks like, right? We can reconstruct the other side, right? And so Merleau-Ponty says, well, seeing is just a delayed form of touching. So for Merleau-Ponty, seeing and touching are not at the same ontological level. Touching or tactile sensations are primary to seeing, which makes sense if we think about children and how they develop, right? And when they start seeing. Seeing is, I think, I'm not sure, but I think it's probably one of the least, or it's the final faculties of sensation, right, that become active. But the point is, when we look at something and we think we're just looking at it as the empiricist would have it, right? We're just making observations and drawing conclusions, where actually something much more complex is happening. Through seeing, we have already unconsciously made or intuited all the possible forms of grasping. So seeing contains within itself various modes of grasping, of touching. So seeing as a perception is in a way ontologically subordinate to tactile sensation. And the point here is that the invisible is just a folding in of the visible. So when somebody looks at me and they smile, right, there's a visible aspect to this, right, which is a complex facial gesture. But there's also the invisible behind it of what does the smile mean? Is this person happy? Are they in a good mood? Are they going to kill me? Why are they smiling, right? And so, but the invisible is nothing more than a layered manifestation of the visible. The reason I can infer to something complex as an emotion is because I have perceptually grasped multiple manifestations of what it means to be happy. So thought does not precede language, but takes shape through it, right? This is important. When I'm speaking to someone, I'm not communicating my thoughts. I am forming them as I speak. The fact that I have an idea that I want to communicate with you is a kind of a rational myth, a Cartesian myth that we've been selling ourselves throughout, through subjectification, through our historical shaping of our epistemic regime, right? So when I speak, what I speak and what I want to say is actually shaped in the process of speaking. It does not precede it. It is not anterior to it. So expression is not the translation of a pre-existing interiority. It is the coming into being of sense. So language, like perception, is generative. It discloses rather than delivers. So it is very much like making a clearing. And just like with Merleau-Ponty, just like with Heidegger, similarly with Merleau-Ponty, there's a danger of idle chatter, right? Of falling into facticity. Because if we really want to say something meaningful, we need to create rupture in what he calls the swarm of gestures. So for Merleau-Ponty, language is a swarm of gestures that becomes institutionalized. And through the institutionalization, it passes through multiple thresholds of normalization, formalization, and so forth, which creates authentic expression very difficult, right? So the layering of language through normalization of particular ways of speaking actually prevents real expression from taking place. So opacity for Merleau-Ponty is not the problem. In fact, the problem is transparency or the illusion of transparency, which is directly tied to the problem of algorithmic thinking, right? Because we think expression, language, the human body, it's a matter of fact before everything is reduced to the binary logic of algorithms. It's only a matter of time till we can find the underlying structure of everything, the brain, the mind, language, and then everything will be fully transparent, right? But he says this is a very dangerous prejudice, and the origins of this prejudice are not just the natural attitude in science, it's also Cartesian solipsism, right? The idea that we can have a disembodied subject, right? The disembodied subject of pure reason. He says there's no such thing. And so this is why the opacity is not a defect of language, it is the condition of its possibility. This opacity, this unformalizable residue, is the domain of our agency. So unlike the Sartrean consciousness, which is pure transparent consciousness, with Merleau-Ponty, consciousness, and I wouldn't even use the word conscious, I would use the word body, but it gets confusing because when you say body, people think body as opposed to me, or body as opposed to my mentality, my mind, right? But no, body is consciousness. You are a body. It's just that your body is more complex than what medical discourse likes to make of it, right? Back to Keli's example, right? I think at least partially, right, a lot of problems that Keli encountered had to do with how the medical gaze views the body, right, as something that can be just laid out on a flat surface like a bunch of truth tables, right? The body can just be flattened onto an ontological surface of pure transparency or a coordinate plane, right? But there's a fundamental opacity to the body, an irreducible opacity that actually has to do, which is not a calculation problem or statistical error. That's just who I am, right? You're trying to get rid of the most important part, right? Like Foucault said, nobody ever asks, "How are you?" Right? They're just asking, "Where does it hurt?" They don't care about you or how you're feeling. And that's supposed to make it look more scientific, but it's depending on where you come from, it can be as bad as slow genocide. Now, words are gestures in a field of meanings that is always partial, shifting, and layered, right? So for Merleau-Ponty, there is no bigger lie than thinking that you can say something completely and be done with it. Not only is that impossible, but it constitutes a kind of fascism, right? A kind of final word on things, right? But he says authentic communication, effective actually communication, even practical communication always leaves a kind of openness to further modify what you're saying, to admit that this is a process and not an object, right? So communication is body is a process, right? The body is not an object for Merleau-Ponty. Body is a process, and it's a process that is open to interaction. Similarly, communication is a process that is open to the flesh of the other. So the other person, so it is a fundamental condition of care that our discourse remains open. It's not just an epistemic problem, it's an ethical problem. So against the algorithm's dream of perfect equivalence between sign and meaning, Merleau-Ponty reminds us that even in mathematics, truth is not revealed, but developed, right? This is important, and we can also trace this to Thomas Kuhn's work, right? The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because fundamentally what makes science interesting, right, is not when everything is completely explained, but the unexplainable, the room for novelty, right? So to be completely honest with ourselves, it's not science that we love, it's scientific revolutions that we love, because those are the most exciting. That's where we actually have a breakthrough. And really, I think the last thing that any scientist wants to do is what Kuhn calls normal science, right? Because what is normal science? Normal science, when you have a theory, it's well established, and you're just gathering data and applying the existing theory to new fields, right? I mean, it's good, honest work, but that's not the ambition that drives most scientists, right? The ambition is to make a discovery. And you can't make a discovery without destroying some old theories or modifying them to a considerable degree, right? And so all of this has to do with novelty. All of this has to do with opacity. It has to do with the fact that opacity is a fundamental ontological structure, not just of being, but of doing science as well. So even the natural attitude could be criticized from the inside, right? We can say, well, technically the natural attitude, even from a scientific perspective, is not correct. I mean, it's not good because you're not leaving any room for new discoveries. So even the most transparent forms of language algorithms depends on expressive opacity. We forget the expressive shift that made the formula possible and confuse its clarity for origin. But this clarity is retrospective. It masks the creative movement that gave it form. So I think we can argue that even in science, you need to have a kind of slang. And by slang, I mean creating the opportunity for new metaphors. Because in the end, no matter how abstract, no matter how correct your theories are, you have to come down from that realm of abstraction and explain it to us. You have to dumb it down for us, because otherwise you're not relevant. No one's going to fund your research. You have to make it clear in plain terms why your research is relevant. In order to do that effectively, you need to get creative, right? You need to find new metaphors and new ways of speaking about the life world, right? About the life world. You need to come back to the life world and share your discoveries. In order to do that effectively, you need to show us how it modifies and makes our being together at least more bearable. So that's the creative movement that is fundamental, not just to science, but to our ethical engagement with each other. So expression is thus not a delivery mechanism, but a mode of inhabiting. Words resonate not because they point, but because they vibrate with gesture. Signification bursts out above the signs, and yet it is only their vibration. The way a cry carries outside and makes present to everyone the very breathing and pain of the man crying out, right? So this is similar to the example on slang, right? Because if we look at the genealogy of the word pain, at some point we will find a kind of onomatopoeic origins to it. So it's not quite onomatopoeia because it doesn't have to sound exactly the way it sounds, right? What is onomatopoeia, right? So onomatopoeia is it's what they teach you in introduction to literature or literary theory. Onomatopoeia is when the word sounds like what it designates, right? So Like if somebody, like boom or what other examples? Or I can't ringing. I guess ringing kind of sounds like ringing, right? It actually sounds like ringing if you say it in a certain way. Um, so onomatopoeia is an excellent sort of watered down example of what Merleau-Ponty talks about, because it is an artistic reflection of what the word designates, but it's obviously more complex than that. But the point is, it's neither structuralist like with Saussure, where we have a chain of signifiers and then a chain of things, and the relation between the signifier and what it signifies, the signified, is completely arbitrary, right? For Merleau-Ponty, it's not arbitrary, but the origins of the connection may be hidden. That's the difference, right? So why the word pain designates, right, this the sensation of unpleasant affective states is not obvious from the word pain, because, well, the word just sounds like pain. Doesn't sound like pain, doesn't sound like ouch. The word pain in isolation is not artistically representative of unpleasant sensations. But if we trace the history, perhaps, or the genealogy of the word pain, then eventually we would find something like this. We would find something similar to say it with your chest, right? Something like that. So now opacity is necessary, once again, because it's generative, right? So it's where meaning comes from, it's where new structures come from, and therefore it's where new life worlds can emerge out of, right? And this idea of producing new forms of expression to allow for the recognition of different life worlds is politically relevant, because there might already be people, right, like the Palestinian people, right, who are being dehumanized. Their discourse is being completely covered over, right? So if we came up with new poetic ways of speaking or listening and revealing, right, then we could allow for the creation of life worlds that are more inclusive, right? But also creating what Deleuze called lines of flight, right? Creating new forms of expression can allow for alternative modes of being that helps us escape not just algorithmic capture, but any form of totalizing discourse, right? That says this is how it is, this is how we should speak about things. There's no alternative, right? So what algorithms cannot capture is not the structure of language, because there is no structure to language, right? Once again, this is how we distance ourselves from Husserl, I think, a little bit. It's that there's no structure to language, there is only a style to language. And it's the style that links the flesh to the world, perception to history, gesture to silence. So language resists capture not by being obscure, but by being more than the system that tries to contain it. To express is not to master meaning, but to let it happen, right? So once again, we go back to Heidegger, allowing things to dwell on their own being, reveal themselves on their own terms. Now, the third axis, right, the third axis of resistance, or the third axis of Merleau-Ponty's ontology, is that of institution and history. Now, language emerges through the body or through the flesh of intercorporeal becoming through the gesture, right? So the gesture is the first instance, or the first transitional moment from body to language. And poetry essentially tries to dwell in the domain of gestures. In fact, what I think poetry does is it allows language to revert back to gesture, because there's something that happens with language and poetry where words aren't used the way they're supposed to be used. And the literary techniques of imagery, right, they often rely on sense data, right? Because we have tactile imagery, we have visual imagery, right? We have 5 different categories of imagery, each of which refers to our senses, right? Auditory imagery, visual imagery, gustatory, tactile imagery, right? So when we're getting creative with language, a lot of people would say that we are actually distancing ourselves from the true structure of language, which is considered to be logical, right? and I actually had, to bring a personal example, I often argue with my girlfriend. She's a she just got her computer science degree, right? And so we are so different about language, and we're so different about how we speak. And because the more, like, the way I work is, when I'm arguing, the more you corner me, the more I panic. Actually, the more creative I get in how I express myself, right? But she's the other way around. She becomes if you corner her with questions, she becomes logical and structured, and it's like one answer per one question, right? It's just everything becomes perfect because that's how she was trained, that's how I was trained. But like you, Keli, I'm very biased, so that the I do think that the nature of language is fundamentally poetic and not algorithmic, right? Yeah, hell yeah. And so, um, but it gets frustrating because if you are talking to a person and you think um, what they're saying is a complex construct that you want to dismantle into something, and turns out it's not for them, right? You fall into a very dangerous loop, right? And so I think that's Merleau-Ponty would be on my side, right? He would say, of course he's speaking in metaphors. He would defend me, right? He would say, of course he's speaking in metaphors. Of course he's speaking um, in artistic metaphors, because he's reverting to his embodied experience, right? In fact, he's trying to get rid of language because his pure being lies in his corporeal being. And so there's a kind of nostalgia, we can say, with poetic language, an unconscious nostalgia, uh, um, that language wants to go back to its corporeal being, right? And this does remind me of Lacan, right? Because with Lacanian theory, we have language as a kind of violence that is done to the subject. Right? Language, we are infected with language, right? It's Lacan's idea. In fact, it's through language that the subject becomes alienated from themselves. It's not so violent with Merleau-Ponty, but just similar with Merleau-Ponty, language is an offshoot of something that is more primordial, which is flesh. So words, according to Merleau-Ponty, are linguistic gestures that have acquired institutional limitation within the conventions of a culture. Okay, so there's a paradox of language, right? We have a kind of ambivalent relationship with language because on one side, language constrains our creative forms, our creative ability to express ourselves, right? Grammar specifically, right? Grammar constrains the ways I can express myself. And most of the time, most good poetry violates rules of grammar, right? I mean, maybe the whole idea of poetry can be reduced to violating the rules of grammar. That's pretty much how we know that we're dealing with a poetic work of art, right? It violates the rules of grammar. It doesn't follow normal conventions of speaking and communication. So institutionalization is a kind of domestication of the flesh. It's a domestication of the body. It's a domestication of gesture. Whether it's necessary or not is actually an interesting question, but it's definitely necessary today. Because if I only spoke with people with whom I have an immediate shared life world, I wouldn't go very far, right? All the forms of communication or digital media, all of this would become, if not useless, I would become very, very selective as to whom I would be able to communicate with. But the more important problem is that the gesture or tribal language tends to have an openness that it's just too open. The spectrum of interpretations is too large. There's too many ways to interpret a gesture. And that creates problems in organizing societies, right? You can't really organize a society around gestures because, well, different people interpret it in different ways, right? So in a way, gesture is the opposite of command, right? So we can think of a graph, right? On the one hand, we have poetic expressions, gestures, and the life world at its most raw, most perceptual level. On the other hand, we have commands, right? So the command, we can say, is the exact opposite of gesture, and somewhere in between, we have institutionalized normal language. And normal language is practical, but it still does not allow us to do philosophy or phenomenology properly. Because if we want to do phenomenology properly, we must return to the gestural and embodied origins of language. And so how is this an act of resistance, right? Unless it's already pretty obvious. Well, if I'm going back to the poetic expression of language, well, that makes my speaking unformalizable. In fact, ideally, it even makes it uncommodifiable, right? You can't even insert it into the flows of capital, let alone formalize it. Well, today's the same thing, I think, right? Making something algorithmic already sort of paves the grounds to monetizing on it, right? Yeah, or at least you should at least become algorithmic if you want to sell anything, right? Um, so so algorithmic capture and commodification, they go hand in hand, and so this is how the Ponty-esque, right, Merleau-Ponty's version of speaking or doing philosophy, of going back to the life world, is an act of radical resistance, right? So maybe I'll say, how are we with how long have I been rambling?
I haven't been paying attention, but I'm enjoying the ride and
Okay.
got him.
Okay. I'll start approaching the conclusion. Okay. So a little more on history, right? History as meaning making. So temporality is fundamental to both Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. Temporality is the fundamental structure of Dasein. And for Merleau-Ponty as well, temporality is quite important because, like I said, his body is not the static body, right? It's not the algorithmic body, it's not the formalized body, it's not the geometrical body, and it's definitely not the medical body, right? His body is a dynamic body that opens up to new possibilities and is always subject to transformation, and the body is always communal, right? And when I say communal, it's important to understand it's not that somebody's body belongs to somebody. We are way beyond the notions of possession, right? It's not about possession or property. No, it's about how your body is constituted with your relation to other bodies, to other people, to the regimes of visibilities and invisibilities. So Merleau-Ponty defines institution as the founding of meaning, as we said already, as the organization of gestures, or a kind of channeling of flesh, right? An organization of flesh. It's the establishment of rigid norms. And the institutionalization is what allows them to become historicized, right? So the repetition of a gesture is the foundation of history, right? The fact that I can repeat a gesture is what creates the conditions of possibility for language and history as such. So history in, I guess, the authentic sense, right? Not the history where I read a textbook and I realize, oh, somebody else has written the history of Georgia and has completely disregarded my experience of Georgia because they don't even know who I am. That's a different history, right? That's the history that you want to actually challenge, and Foucault does that. But Merleau-Ponty has a much more harmonious understanding of history as how history emerges from the life world and then becomes institutionalized into what we call historiography, right? So the institution of history. But nonetheless, Merleau-Ponty's idea of history is not a linear history. So he does make the distinction between what we call historiography, right, where in many ways, other people decide for you what your history is, right, which is another regime of invisibilities, right? It's another regime of discourse that has been detached from its embodied corporeal roots, right, from its life world. And has acquired a life of its own, as is in fact, it is. So if we think of a diagram, right? So I have my life world, I'm within a community, and we have a history, right? And there's somebody else in Russia, in US, doesn't matter, and they are writing a history of Georgia, right? Now, if they are doing it properly, right, as a good Merleau-Pontian philosopher historian should, what they should want to do is, first of all, not lie to themselves that they will be projecting elements of their life world into this history. They will do that. So to say that, no, I'm objectively writing history of Georgia has nothing to do where I'm from, well, you're already in bad territory here with Merleau-Ponty. So not only are you supposed to admit that your life world has contributed to this, but you must also understand what your goal is. And your goal is not to write a linear chronological history where one objective fact follows another objective fact, but you have to be a little artistic about it. If you're not a little artistic about it, you're not going to do it right, because you're supposed to get to the life world, and the life world is fundamentally artistic. It's corporeal and artistic, right? So if you want to be a good historian, you have to be an artist. You have to understand the intimate relationships between the regimes of visibilities, which are fundamentally hidden to you because you haven't lived here, right? So on the other hand, a good historian would obviously come to Georgia and live here. But if you're writing about a historical period that is in the past, right? If you're not writing a modern anthropology of Georgians, but you're writing about the history, then, well, there's no way, obviously, for you to transport back in time. So how do you uncover the domain of visibilities, which is obscured through documents and writings of other historians and accounts of other historians? You only have the invisible domain. You only have language, right? You can't get to the corporeal. You can't get to the visible. So you have to use artistic induction, whatever that means. You have to use some sort of artistic induction to get to the life world that you're trying to write about. And it is mystical. I mean, there's no other way to go about it. It has to be some sort of mystical experience that you have in reconstructing that life world. If you remain rigid and scientific and empirical, your historical analysis is not going to carry a lot of weight with Merleau-Ponty. So what you need to do, you have to do a phenomenology of historical flesh. Institution and history are ontological categories in Merleau-Ponty's late thought, just as the body is not in space, but of it. In fact, space is produced by the body, right? This is a very good way of saying, a little obscure, but I think this is a good. The body produces space. The space is not in the body, but bodied activity is the ontological precondition, the possibility for space to emerge in the first place. History is not in time, once again, but it is the condition of time. Different cultures conceive of time in a different way. So if you're writing about a culture that perceives time in a nonlinear fashion, you can't write that history in a linear fashion. You have to understand that nonlinearity through the situated perception of that culture. And you have to write in a way that the representative of that culture would write. And that would constitute your relationship with the life world of the other as, once again, chiasmatic. That is the chiasm, right? The chiasm is when my experience is reversed, as I am not only experiencing a text, even a text, but the text is experiencing me. The text is entering into my life world, and it is shaping me. So to grasp the life world in Merleau-Ponty's later ontology is to see it as the very milieu in which history happens, not as a backdrop, but so it doesn't happen in history, it shapes history, right? So not as a thick stratified atmosphere of instituted sense. The life world is historical, not merely because it contains events, but because it is composed of institutions sedimented in the flesh of perception. It is the field where expressive acts, gestures, utterances, discoveries become operative without becoming static, where meaning unfolds as a dynamic interplay between sedimentation and reactivation. In this light, the life world is not a static given, not a neutral horizon, not a universal structure, but a temporal openness. It carries forward prior meanings, not as dogma, but as latency. We do not stand apart from it as knowing subjects. We are interacting with it. So you can't understand something without modifying it, without interacting it, without changing it. And when you're investigating something phenomenologically, you have to understand that it is changing you and you are changing it. And the final outcome might be nothing like what you were in the beginning and what the so-called object of your investigation was in the beginning. So you are leaving an impact. So phenomenology with Merleau-Ponty is never, so to speak, clean, right? It's never clean in this epistemic sense. A transformation needs to occur. So descriptions, we don't have descriptions with Merleau-Ponty, we have interactions, right? So to do phenomenology, we must interact with things and we must create things. We must shape things. This is how phenomenology is done with Merleau-Ponty. So returning to the implications to our digital present, right? So in this sort of cybernetic machinic world where we're dominated by sensors, patterns, biometrics, predictive models, we have a temptation to think of perception as processing information, to speak of truth in terms of computation. But what this does, it instead of revealing the life world or creating opportunities for new life worlds to emerge, it is colonizing the life world, right? So we experience a colonization of life world that renders it static, dead, computable, uninteresting, consumerist, however you'd like to look at it. So phenomenology does not reject machines. It simply reminds us that lived meanings exceed the conditions of formalization, right? This also reminds me of the Foucauldian philosophy of science, right? Because Foucault said discourse had four different thresholds before something would become a science, right? And Foucault's point was that, in fact, the first threshold, which is almost identical to Merleau-Ponty's idea of the life world, is actually fundamental. So the problem of science is when we pass the threshold of positivity or scientificity or formalization, which is the final one, what happens is that we lose touch to the embodied origins of why the scientific theory came about in the first place. And when we do that, we might have zombies, right? We might have scientific theories that are in fact zombies, right? The dead flesh of the invisible, right? We can say poetically, right? So when the invisible remains as dead flesh, when it's no longer tied to anything real in the world, to its creative origins, we have dead theories. And the problem with dead theories is not that they hang around just because scientists want to. Just because scientists are, they're very thick-skinned and they like to cling to their theories. They're not like philosophers, which is not a bad thing. It depends on which philosophers we're talking about. I think Husserl had thicker skin than maybe most scientists I can think of. But, for the rest of us, on average, a scientist has thicker skin than a philosopher. But the point is that's not the only reason, right? It's not just that scientists don't want to let go of their beloved theories which they've dedicated their whole lives, but because we live in an age, and this is a purely, I despise all forms of imperialism, and myself, my country is a victim of specifically Russian imperialism. It's just that Russian imperialism is just something you fight. It's not very interesting to analyze. You know what I mean? It's not very interesting. It's very superficial, my point is. But Western imperialism is very interesting to analyze for me because it's very sophisticated, right? And this is why I'm talking about this. It's because it has to do with dead scientific theories, right? Because a lot of fascism in the West comes from politicians taking dead theories and then appealing to an audience that is just educated enough to understand the dead theories, but not educated enough to understand why they're dead, right? So this aura of pseudo-intellectualism, pseudo scientists, right? This is biopolitics par excellence, right? This is biopolitics because it is used politically, right? And so I guess I can summarize. This is a good place to summarize. So, Merleau-Ponty's notion of the life world can help us challenge these very elaborate forms of sophisticated forms of totalitarian fascism that actually use pretty good scientific theories, not correct ones, but pretty sophisticated scientific theories, which sound like they should still be relevant, but are actually dead theories, to reinforce prejudices, xenophobia, racism, all sorts of gender binaries, um, all forms of oppression, pseudo-intellectualist oppression, and they do this precisely by erasing the origins of the theory, erasing the origins of the regime of invisibilities by forgetting about the life world, the corporeal, the flesh of it all is being eroded. Right. So I think that summarizes everything I wanted to say. So the Merleau-Ponty's life world is foundational, and it's fundamental not just in this sort of epistemic ontological sense, but also in the ethical sense. It can help us become more critical criticizers and more ethical subjects. Yeah, as a side note, I want to say, because we had Heidegger, the Nazi, on one hand, and then Sartre, the Stalinist, on the other, right? And so thankfully we have Merleau-Ponty, who was quite okay, in most regards, at least, because he was a Marxist, but he was not a USSR Marxist, right? So he was the good kind of Marxist. And he was part of the French resistance, and he criticized the Soviet Union a lot, right? So, yeah, happy to be representing Merleau-Ponty. That's it for me. Thank you.
I have a few questions, but I'd like to open up the floor for others to go first, if they would like. Okay. Interrupt me because I have two. If if something comes up. First question I had about this this artistic induction to get to the life world and reconstructing history. So I was reading this article by Thomas Reiber about Husserl and fantasy. He talks about fictional worlds and how they might relate to our real world, and says that while there are objects in fantasy worlds and there's a logic to them, and uh, we can either suspend believability or however. Husserl would say we're not suspending. We know that we're reading a book, but we can believe what's going on given a good logos. But he says the objects in these books are quasi-transcendental. In order for that an object to be transcendental, it has to come from reality, fixed through our sense perception and visceral being here in this world. But that leads to interesting thoughts about history, because we're not directly experiencing that as well. So I'm going to read this quote, and then I have a question about how Merleau-Ponty would respond. So he writes, a fictional world, because it is an immanent product of consciousness and is not transcendental in any real sense, does not qualify as a possible world because it was not intended as such, and because it cannot be subjected to the same determination as the real world. Although he will say that, utopias and those type of things do have bearing on our real world. Anyways, he goes on. However, one could argue with equal force that many histories do not reveal a transcendental object which is verifiable through a series of evidential chains. Nevertheless, though historical texts may not lead to positional modifications which can validate their descriptions in every case, they still lead to some direct verification and much verification that is indirect. Moreover, history is intentionally directed to truthfully describing or explaining what has happened in the actual world, whereas fiction operates in the created world. He goes on. So I'm wondering about this line between fiction and history, and I am skeptical of that claim that historical texts are intentionally directed to truthfully describing or explaining what has happened. As someone who comes from Virginia, from the South, the Civil War was always one of Northern aggression. They started it. It's about states' rights. Then you go off to learn more and go, oh, no, that was not a truthful description at all. That was a complete erasure of the truth. So I'm wondering about just how fictional history is here. Can we draw lines? Ooh.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think you're very right to do so, to be skeptical there, because and your example is very good because it's already so convoluted. Because what Husserl does there, I think, is he already assumes the immanence of consciousness as a given, right? So he first assumes the immanence of consciousness and the transcendence of objects, right, through intentionality. And so Merleau-Ponty would immediately say, before we move on to talking about fiction and literature, let's stop right here, because Merleau-Ponty does not think there is an immanence of consciousness. In fact, he thinks that is a mistake. The idea that there's an immanence of consciousness and the transcendence onto objects that needs to be sort of bridged, right? This is the whole problem that he's deconstructing, and it's reflected in his critique of intellectualism and empiricism as well. Because he says, if you're going to assume the immanence of consciousness and the transcendental ego as this pure whole that somehow needs to transcend itself onto the objects of the world outside, he thinks you will not be able to reconcile that difference. So you will either be trapped in solipsism or skepticism. And so what he says, if we first need to deconstruct this idea of the immanence of consciousness and understand that I do not have a unity of consciousness. In fact, I have a collection of partial embodied experiences that point to something that is distinct from its surroundings that I call the I. But this unity of I is really partial. It's really not a closed system. And so from this point of view, when we read fiction, well, I mean, we would just have a completely different understanding of what it means to read fiction, right? It would have to do with perhaps projecting my perceptual experiences into an even more partial and even more incomplete world that I have to reconstruct by positing other perceptual gestalts, right? Gestalt. Merleau-Ponty was a big fan of Gestalt psychology. He thinks Gestalt more or less captures what he means by flesh and his entire ontology. So I think that's the important. I mean, how Merleau-Ponty would read fiction, I think, is less interesting. But he would definitely say that the line between fiction and nonfiction is not rigid at all, completely arbitrary. But fundamentally, he would say, I'm not transcending onto objects at all. In fact, I am always in a relation, a chiasmatic reversible relation with these objects. And that's how I read literature.
Thank you. Excellent answer. I appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
One more concern I have just about writing in such a way that the culture you're writing about is captured, and we're remaining respectful towards that. I do see an issue, another one just from American history, good God, is white authors who during the Civil War or prior, or even during Reconstruction, who are trying to, in an authentic way, support enslaved folks, their emancipation, and their thriving after the Civil War. And so they want to write authentically, and what we get is ebonics and white people trying to to recreate that cadence, that dialect, and it just is so racist and comes about off. And then we get these tropes of minstrel shows and blackface developing out of that. So I wonder if there is um, a potential for inauthenticity that might, even if inadvertently, lead to mischaracterizations of a culture and a language and making it cartoony even.
Yeah, excellent. Let's see if I understand the question. So the question here is, if we write history as fiction, how do we protect ourselves from the falsification of history, is what you're saying.
Or if so, you were speaking earlier of writing about other cultures, and you're not a part of that culture. You want to reconstruct that as authentically and carefully as possible, and then maybe write in such a way that that culture would write to sort of capture their
Hmm.
cadence and
Hmm.
mannerisms and lingo, maybe their slang. Um, I wonder where the line is there between earnestly trying to do that and then making what at least would be in America is the white savior complex mistake of inadvertently creating tropes and um,
Okay, okay, I understand. I understand. Yeah, creating caricatures of the culture, which exoticizing, right? I think that's the word we're looking is exoticizing a culture, right? Because
yeah.
exoticizing a culture means you're pretending you're shaping solidarity, but you're really just um, turning them into an object of entertainment, right? Um, right. Well, I mean, that would have to do with the depth of the analysis, right? We would have to do with how sophisticated the analysis is. And writing in terms of fiction does not mean writing unseriously, right? We can write serious fiction, right? Um, but right, the point is, if we resort to facticity, right? And Husserl was the one that says, right, fact-minded. Uh, what is that about being fact-minded and the problem of being fact-minded?
merely merely fact-minded sciences make for merely fact-minded people.
Yeah, yeah, I love that quote. I like that quote. And for a long time, I thought it was Heidegger, and the time, no, that's Husserl. I was like, what? How did Husserl come up with this? I'm joking. Um, um, but yeah, so the idea of dwelling within a discourse, right? That's the problem here. It's just dwelling within a discourse. And the thing is, if you have really done the work, it shows. Because fiction doesn't mean you get to say whatever you want. That's another misconception, right? Um, you are still constrained by the text. You are still constrained by the official documents. You're still constrained by the archive. The archive will not let you to write a superficial history or deny the facts. So we're not talking here about fact of denying facts or anti-science, right? We're talking about a level of depth where you've done so much research that there is now room for you to interpret, right? So that's the fiction. We're talking about a necessary fiction. So you've gone through all the documents, you've read everything, but now there's more room. And there's no document that tells you how it actually happened, and you need to interpret this creatively. So not only is it the case that we should write fiction, but if we investigate the archives thoroughly enough, we will be faced with the fact that we have to. You can't not. If you feel that you're overwhelmed with data and you can now just summarize the facts, that means you haven't done enough work. You haven't got deep enough to find that domain of poetry and history and art, that artistic creation a good historian will inevitably face.
Okay. Awesome. I love that. Because there's no clear line there, but I like what you said about this level of depth that is at stake. And I think as, as long as you are being earnest there, I think you can be at least adequately good.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you take if you take something as stupid as blackface, right, and then you take Foucault's order of things, right? I mean, granted, Foucault didn't explicitly or at all actually write about marginalized groups, and maybe that's the reason why. But if you look at Foucault's reconstruction of the 17th century, right? I mean, the problem that he's faced with is a different problem, but it's a similar problem. The problem is that he's not there, right? At least that's how we pose the problem fundamentally, right? It's not just the fact that he's white; it's also the which is a real problem, but it's also the problem that the problem that we're discussing it now right now is that he is not there. So the problem is, if I am not there, how do I reconstruct that history? And if you read Foucault and you compare it to caricatures, you will see the difference. You will see the difference.
More Foucault in my future. Excellent. Especially since that tarot card reader just brought him up. It's a sign. Go read Foucault. Okay, that was awesome. I appreciate those answers. Others. I'm gonna stretch before I have to go back into Sartre. Okay. We'll move on to Sartre. This one won't be as long. I am less informed of Sartre than I am even of Heidegger, and for both reasons I don't like them, is they just offend me so much in the things that they say, whether it be the things they say about Husserl in Heidegger's sense, or the frigid woman and the wait staff when when Sartre is talking about bad faith. So I'll get into my grievances there. But first, we'll go into a bit of his notion of being in itself and for itself, and being in nothingness, and the sort of social world that comes out of that, because he doesn't make use of the term life world, really. And then we'll move on to what he says in his critique of the dialectical reason, that'll give us a more robust sense of this social world that I think is akin to the life world and this world of objects that we find ourselves in. So we spoke of Sartre's notion of being in the same presentation wherein we covered Heidegger's notion of Dasein, but we'll go over a quick review. As I said, because he does not make use of the term life world directly, though he lands somewhere near it. So being in itself is this state of existence within facticity that is prior to any essence that we might assign to it. He is critical of Husserl's project of essences. Essences represent this sort of way that we comport ourselves to ourselves and world, and we could comport ourselves to ourselves in any other way. So to think of ourselves as having this essence first, no, we comport ourselves in such a way that we capitulate having an essence, and that essence might be a way to hide. For example, I'm just a drummer. I've got an attitude, so that's the reason I carry this attitude everywhere. I can't help it. I'm a drummer. That's my essence. Well, or I'm hill folk. I got an attitude and I run my mouth, and that's why I get in trouble everywhere I go. Well, is it your essence that you're hill folk and you're wild? I don't know. I'm going to stick to it, but that might be bad faith. But anyways, being for itself is that comportment towards this radically free being, and it negates through the for itself and transcends this existence of just radically free consciousness, freely choosing to comport itself through acts of determination within that facticity of our situation. It is a unity of primary source in a way, again, to transcend. And out of this negation, we create a sort of nothingness, an inauthentic understanding of self and a way of relating to each other. And this negation, and nothingness constitutes an ontological condition for us. We are all free beings. And at the same time, we are objects for others, not objects in the same way that physical material things by themselves are. We're special. We're subjects, but something to be objectivated nonetheless. I see you all as presenters, as philosophals, and all of those are just wonderful, wonderful things, but I'm still objectivating you, and there might come with some pressure with being a philosophal or with being a presenter. And any attempt we make to determine ourselves through radical acts of comportment are met with a challenge of others' perception over which we have no control. So we create our understanding of self and world through a dance with our own self-determination and negation and the gaze of the other, which we also seek to negate. We seek to escape our objectivization by further objectifying ourselves otherwise. I have not done research into this. This is just me. Maybe others have said this as well, but it looks to me like the emergence of the noble attitude and resistance in Nietzsche, this beyond good and evil, and the development of this master-slave dynamic, as he writes, in close juxtaposition, even in the same man with one soul. When I'm practicing my drums, even no one's looking at me, but I know there's going to be an audience. I know what my drum teacher would say if he saw me moving my foot that way. I have all these other gazes in my head, and I have to deal with that. So this gaze we internalize and we take with us. We fall into bad faith whenever we forget our ownership of our comportments, especially with this original comportment and then a reactive comportment, which is another comportment. We're going to comport again to assert our freedom. So we fall into bad faith when we forget our ownership, and that's easy to do. My goodness, it's almost necessary to get through everyday life. If we were to spend every single moment reflecting on our radical freedom and how is it I'm going to comport myself this day and this moment, and what does it mean, and what does that mean to the other? Good God, you're going to end up on the 5th floor on lockdown, unable to talk your way out of being committed. So there is a sort of anonymity, this sort of norms that we generate that are akin to Heidegger's idle chatter and das Mann. What would one do in this situation? So whenever you're acting some way, as a drummer would, well, I'm just a drummer. That of course I'm acting that way. I'm in bad faith. I'm a hill folk and I'm wild, and that's why I'm acting this way. No. There was resentment, there was reaction, there were all these other elements that motivated me to freely choose to act as I did and to escalate whatever situation I was in. So bad faith happens when we cover over the responsibility we hold towards our comportments and blame it on norms or any other thing. So we rather lie to ourselves in these moments about the origin of the way we relate to the norms of social life, which poses a tricky issue, because how do you lie to yourself if you were the one knowing the truth and the lie that is happening? It's happening very, very deep, very deeply. And perhaps with psychoanalysis, we can uncover that original moment of bad faith and heal ourselves. At least as he's writing in his early work. In any event, being for itself is an absolute event of self-objectivation that can lead to conflict and alienation from ourselves and from others. Social life is fundamentally an attempt to control the impact of that gaze upon us. Sartre's not a fan of the intersubjective realm. Hell is other people. It imposes restrictions upon the individual, though he does not deny our intimate connection with each other. So as we are attempting to determine ourselves through these radical acts of comportment, we're met with the challenge of others' perceptions, and we create our own gaze. So I want to go back and talk about bad faith. He uses the example of of a woman on a date, and they've had a good time. The man goes to hold her hand, and she just takes it as we're just holding hands, ignoring the deeper meaning of that gesture. We know where this is going. We know that this stroll down the street is going to lead to your house, and then we're going to go, oh, maybe we'll have a nightcap, and then whatever else happens after that. The woman in that situation is in bad faith by not recognizing that she is choosing to ignore all of the connotations and other motivations and meaning that comes with holding hands after a date. And my thought is, Sartre, just because she doesn't want to hold your clammy, nasty hand does not mean she's in bad faith. Maybe the woman is treating it as such because she's had horrible relationships in the past, or horrible encounters in the past, where merely holding hands led to something dangerous. Women have this whole, we have to carry our keys a certain way in the parking lot, always be on alert. Just because she's not acknowledging the deeper motivations doesn't mean she's in bad faith. She might be more aware of her situation than you ever could be, Sartre. I also don't appreciate his example of bad faith talking about the waiter. I was a waitress at the Cracker Barrel for many years. And he says, the waiter thinks that, they have to be the waiter. They forget that they have a choice in how they interact, and they come up and they're too nice. Their smile is fake. Do you need anything? Do you want anything? They're over serving me. Get out of my face. I'm just trying to read and drink my coffee and be bug-eyed and have clammy hands and take drugs and dream about lobsters or whatever. The waitress is in bad faith because they recognize that they refuse to recognize that they are choosing to behave as a waiter would. They are not ultimately restricted by the rules and the mannerisms. And I'm like, tell me you come from money without telling me you come from money. As a waitress, you've got your manager over there with the clipboard and a stopwatch, wondering how long it's taking you to get to the table, and then how long it's going to take you to get the order in. And if you don't do that in time, then you're going to get a bad shift next week. Your money, your livelihood is at stake. The waiter knows full well that they could just dump that iced tea all over that bitch who said what to me, but they know that they need to live and pay rent and all that stuff. So, excuse me, sir, how do you know that they are in bad faith? They might have very good reasons for doing what they're doing. So, identifying bad faith in the individual yourself is difficult to do, and even more difficult to do in the other. At least in everyday situations. I think you would have wonderful examples to pull from, Sartre, if you were referencing political figures instead of people who were beneath you. But that's my angry rant about Sartre. So world life, I think, in his notion of this radical freedom, does not allow us to explore deeper motivations for why we choose to comport ourselves the way they do, which I think leads to more bad faith. And I think even though he does recognize facticity and that there are greater motivations determining our actions and how we comport ourselves, that radical freedom itself might be a mythical construction. Anyway, so surprisingly, in his later work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, he speaks about class struggle that determines the progression of history. And here we get more into the social ontology and what might look like the social aspect of that life world, the intersubjective determination of our immediately being here and our actual conditions. So the primary choice to engage in that class struggle is also present, and it leads to what he calls a practical inertia. This practical inert is a negation of freedom that leads to alienation in the social world. It treats individuals as numbers, maybe a cog in a machine, and we become alienated from each other in a state of seriality. We're just individuals on our way to work with their earbuds in, getting on the bus. We're not having conversations. We're not creating community. We want to order our food and just have someone drop it off and not have to talk to them. That kind of thing. You get great information when you talk to people and have community. It's really easy for the powers at be to further subject us if they have disintegrated our community and promoted lifestyles that isolate us in our little apartments here. So we have sociology, we have a sociality beyond the look happening here. We're more than being for others. We're motivated by the sedimentation of social practices and mediation in the socio-inert. While he's skeptical of a full revolution, we do see sparks of community coming together in resistance in what he calls a group infusion. Then we get something sort of apocalyptic. I don't want to make any claims about what's happening now, but some could say that we're fusing together collectively in the world, not just here at the Long Term Philosophy Foundation. So we get something apocalyptic when the subjected class just can't take it anymore and fight the powers that be. But because we're doing so in a reactionary way, eventually those who led the revolution, they become the new hierarchy and develop a vertical otherness that just starts the process all over again. We see that in the French Revolution and most revolutions that that happen. I'd like to hope that we're advanced enough to recognize history repeating itself, but current events show that no. But we still must revolt, because good God, we just can't take it anymore, and the life world will just implode otherwise. We have a we subject coming out of this, and we can be sort of co-spectators in a way that eases the pressure of the gaze or the look of others that we see when maybe others are giving a presentation and we all come together as a group and we're just watching that person. This sort of we subject, while not as wild as what we find in Nietzsche, in this dissolution in the Dionysian spirit, or the sort of we-ness that we see in Heidegger, because we still have this radical subjectivity in Sartre. There are ways to ease the pressure of the gaze and to recognize our bad faith, and to come together to create a better social world. But as Giorgi brought up, here's this Stalinism coming in. There's the skepticism that, the revolution will not yield true revolution. It will just start a new pattern of subjugation. So that's all I have for Sartre. If you all have questions, comments, definitely raise them. But whatever answer I give, number one, it's biased, and number two, he's not my cup of tea. So. Or if anybody would like to fill in anything else that I did not cover. Or are we ready for some Franz Fanon? Let's move on. Let's go on to Angela over here. She'll be presenting on Franz Fanon. I am so excited for this. I think he's ever prescient, and we need him now. So take it away.
Thank you. I'm a little bit sleepy, so I'll do my best to be sort of clear. Okay, so I titled the presentation Fanon and the Coloniality of Our Life World. He doesn't talk a lot about life world, but he does talk about world and life and how that's involved, or how is that pierced by the violence of colonization and anti-Blackness. So sort of like the main question that is guiding my rereading of Fanon that I did in these days is like, What does it mean to be alive in our life world? And furthermore, how is this world built and sustained, embedded in a specific historicity? Fanon is addressing this question by exploring the relation between violence, racialization, colonialism, and lived experience. So I'm not gonna go into introducing him again, but Fanon, something very important about Fanon is that he's from Martinique. He was from Martinique, a French colony, and he studied medicine and psychiatry, and that sort of influenced a lot the way he approached this question that I put forward today, because he emphasizes a lot on embodiment and the experience of suffering in a colonial world. So his work is very much informed by his practice as a psychiatrist in Algeria, right? And sort of from there, he tried to build a philosophical reflection from an anti-colonial position without any attempt to be objective. That's very important as well. So there are two key works from Fanon. His first work is Black Skin, White Masks in 1952, and the other one that was published after he died from leukemia, The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961. And between these two works, you see a shift between his first book, in which he explores his experience as a Black man in a colonial world, and how that world is shaped by anti-Blackness, right? That's the first book. And in the second book, his critique moves towards a more general critique of colonization and coloniality in general. And this, of course, shapes by his participation in the Algerian revolutionary struggle in this moment, and his own practice as a psychiatrist in Algeria, treating patients in Algeria suffering from the ailments of colonization in their body, right? So that is going to inform a lot his philosophy. So I'm gonna just what I did in these 2 days was to sort of reread a little bit of Black Skin, White Masks, and the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, which is called On Violence. Sort of reread them with the question in my mind, and I found a few things, because at the beginning I was like, okay, but he doesn't talk about Lifeworld explicitly, but as I read, I started finding interesting things that I will share with you. So, as you know, Black Skin, White Mask is a phenomenological exploration of the destructive effects of colonialism on the body, with a specific focus on anti-Blackness. As Fanon takes as a point of departure his own lived experience and how he sort of discovers, he talks about this as a splitting of or a fragmentation of his own self, or of his own embodied self, as he discovers that his own self embedded in a lived world that is shaped by colonialism cannot live, right? So his own embodied self cannot live or be just like that in a world that is shaped by colonization. And he describes this as a splitting or a fragmentation, a wound that never stops soaring. This is how he describes it. Yeah, so what he talks about here, he focuses here more on racialization rather than colonialism, although of course is there. So he's from his lived experience, he's talking about racialization as it is materialized by historical, political, and cultural conditions of existence, and how these conditions sort of weaved in his own lived experience. So he's talking about his lived experience as a Black man, and how he shows up as a black man in an anti-black world, and how is that immensely painful and petrifying, as I will develop now. So I want to focus my reading on the most famous chapter, which is chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Masks. It's called The Lived Experience of the Black Man, or other translations translated as The Facticity of Blackness. And in this chapter, he opens with a first-person narration of his discovery of this wound that I have been talking about, and how he discovers it through the eyes of a white child that sees him in a train traveling in France. And he points to him precisely his blackness, and he sort of describes that moment as him splitting and fragmenting in a million pieces. So he's discovering in this moment how he, as a black man, does not enter in his full humanity into the space that shapes that life world. So he cannot enter that life world as human or as alive, right? So he's describing here, and it's very telling how he describes this, because he describes this as a petrification, right? He stops being alive, basically. He becomes stone. So how in this life world, that is a colonial world for Fanon, he's not living, but rather petrified. And this becomes even clearer later in The Wretched of the Earth, when he talks about this petrification as being a sort of death boundedness, or inhabiting a space between life and death continuously. So he encounters this petrification in a colonial world in which he discovers that indeed is whiteness the telos and organizing principle of this lived world, right? So he refers to this as a suffocating reification. This is the first, how he describes it first in the first page of this chapter. And how he enters in this colonial life world, not as living, but as an object, as a thing, right? So he says, I open quote, "I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things. My soul to be desirous at the origin of the world, and here I am as an object among other objects." Close quote. And this reification, or this becoming an object, is framed by another important idea or point of departure, or let's say more conclusion of this book, is that as a black man, he's not a man. He's not fully human. He does not appear as fully human in this colonial lived world, right? And he rather, as he inhabits what he calls a zone of non-being. So he cannot inhabit the space of being, or the space of life, or the space of the human in this colonial world. That's what he sort of discovers. And this is painful because he tells that he dreams about the lightness of being. He dreams about knowing things in the world and playing with things in the world and becoming human, right? That's what he dreamed, and that's what he dreamed before arriving to Europe and encountering his own the facticity of his blackness, right? And so this petrification is painful for him because it sort of contrasts with something that he actually desired, and is becoming white, right? Becoming this light being, this lightness of being that he talks about in this chapter, and how becoming this lightness would precisely enable to integrate him into this life world. but he finds out that he can't. Yeah, so this leads him to question what weaves the coloniality and anti-blackness of that life world in which he cannot fully enter as living and as human. And this question sort of becomes the horizon of his own experience as a black man in a colonial world and the source of that very painful recognition. And he talks about this like this. He says, like, I open quote, I explode. Here are the fragments put together by another being, close quote. And this is not just poetic, but is real suffering. As I said before, this is anchored in his work as a psychiatrist and all the pain that he had to treat and live all his life, right? So what he finds is that he cannot really be human and he cannot really be alive in that colonial world, right? Because there is not this fluid reversibility between the world, the subject, and his body. Because he inhabits a white colonial world in which a black man, in which being a black man implies inhabiting this world that installs in myself how do I say this? So this inhabiting a world that installs one's own negation as the telos of my own self, right? So my own negation becomes the telos of my existence. And this is what he calls the discovery of the historical racial schema, or the epidermal and the epidermal racial schema. I'm not gonna go into that. But sort of putting forward this idea that there is a history, a very violent history that is weaved in his embodiment, and it's weaved in his lived experience. So what he encounters in this experience is that, I open quote, he's unable to discover the feverish coordinates of the world, and that I close quote, and that history is woven in his own embodied self, that violent history. And the painful sort of realization here is that his body is not his own, but it's a body always for others, for the white gaze. And in this sort of being always for others, this organic bond between the subject, the world, and his own body is crumbling. He cannot be anymore. And he refers to this as a sort of affective tetanization. I don't know how to pronounce that. Sort of like this continuous muscle contraction and petrification that makes him unable to move, right? To be human. So what he's trying to say here is that coloniality and its mechanisms of racialization are structuring the dynamics of the life world, of being, of truth, and perhaps the very definition of what it means to be living and being human in a colonial world. It is precisely for this reason that he insists that ontology is impossible for the Black man in a colonial world. He says that in page 89. And he always emphasizes that he doesn't want to be objective, and he doesn't want to do an ontology because he knows that objectivity is impossible from that lived experience. And he wants to radicalize sort of phenomenology by taking this experience, his own facticity and his own embodiment as his source of reflection, right? And what that would mean ethically and politically. So, and there is another very important discovery that he does in this chapter, or the narration of that discovery, no? And is that our common life world reveals us white, and he describes it beautifully. He says that the white man is all around me, up above the sky, tearing at his navel. The earth crunches under my feet and sings white, white. All this whiteness burns me to a cinder. Close quote. And this reveals to him that one of the characteristics of this life world, colonial life world in which he lives, is this appropriation of that world itself by whiteness. How whiteness sort of like permeates or attempts to permeate everything and capture everything with the telos of whiteness, right? And for example, he writes in that chapter also, the white man wants the world. He wants it for himself. He discovers that he's the predestined master of the world. He enslaves it. His relationship with the world is one of appropriation. So, and the finding is that amid this whiteness, that he thought it was humanity, but it's not, is in reality that appropriation by humanity itself and the world by whiteness, he discovers his own facticity, and his own facticity in a world that is anti-Black. And he describes it also very beautifully. He says, my Blackness was there, dense and undeniable. It was there as the negation of such white colonial world, right? He is the embodiment of the negation of that telos of whiteness. So the question, and in the chapter, the question here becomes how then from this very deep and hurtful wound, how do we then affirm Black life in this colonial world, right? And he turns to a very important thinker for him, which is Sartre, from the Negritude movement. And he sort of like evaluates what he's trying to say, but he's gonna try to criticize him, saying that that's not gonna be enough. So that was a movement. What Sartre tried to do is to counter colonial narratives, but celebrating sort of the magical qualities of Black identity and its ancestrality, right? So it's deeper connection to the earth, affirming a very long history of a very complex and diverse culture from which we could take something to imagine a decolonized world or a Black world, right? And how these forces sort of could help against the petrification that Fanon is talking about. And he dedicates a great part of this chapter to think through César's poems about this, right? And he comes to the conclusion that this is a very important moment. It is, but it's not enough. It's not enough for the affirmation of Black life. And the chapter ends with what I interpret to be his highlighting of the need for decolonization, right? And why this affirmation of Black identity is not enough, right? And I'm gonna read you one passage from the end of this chapter, because it ends right in the right moment to enter into the other text, which is the wretched of the earth. So, so he found out that what this affirmation of sort of the connection of Blackness with the earth and these magical qualities and ancestral history often become instrumentalized by whiteness to sort of acquire vitality. For example, he says that when the white man feels too petrified, too mechanized, he goes back to people of color to find the spice or find some kind of aliveness that makes it feel invigorated, right? So he ends up there, And then he says, okay, it could be instrumentalized, but I also need this affirmation for my own self. I know it's not enough, but I need it. And he ends the chapter in this way. Yet, with all my being, I refuse to accept this amputation. I feel my soul as vast as the world, truly a soul as deep as the deepest of rivers. My chest has the power to expand to infinity. I was made to give, and they prescribe me for the humanity of the cripple. When I opened my eyes yesterday, I saw the sky in total revulsion. I tried to get up, but the eviscerated silence surged towards me with paralyzed wings. Not responsible for my acts, at the crossroads between nothingness and infinity, I began to weep. So I sort of always interpret this part as the great point to go to the wretched of the earth, because it's a tragic moment in which he realizes that affirmation of Black life is not enough, and why it's not enough. And I interpret this as being the opening for the need of decolonization and the need of collective political action, right? And this comes in The Wretched of the Earth, which was published in 1961 after his death. He dictated this work to his wife. She transcribed it. He didn't wrote it. He was too sick. And in this work, he presents us with a reflection on the relationship between violence and the structure for decolonization in the context of Algeria, but also in more general terms, what does it mean to think about the possibility of dismantling a colonial world, right? And the first chapter of this book is dedicated to this, and is titled On Violence, right? And in here, he's highlighting the need for social, economic, and political collective liberation to imagine a non-colonial lived world, let's say. Not just to imagine, but to build it, right? And for Fanon, this is inherently a violent process, as it requires the creation of a new humanity from a world that is already pierced and shaped by colonial violence, right? And here he comes with a very important concept that sort of shapes how he thinks about decolonization and how our colonial world is shaped, and is the compartmentalization of this world, or what he calls a Manichaean world, divided in two. Okay, and it's very important here that he refers to this in very material ways, right? This is a material configuration, a spatial configuration, right? It's built and very material in our body, in our affectivity, but also in space. So he talks about this configuration as the division between two different species, right? A world divided in two, and in which that border is continuously guarded. A zone of non-being, or a zone of non-life, and a zone of being and a zone of life, and how that border needs to be kept, guarded, managed with different things like police, like agents, like spatial configurations of buildings, the psychiatric institutions, etc. Right? And I want to read how he describes this configuration, because it's very telling how material this is. So this is not just about imaginaries and hierarchies between white people and the other people of color, right? It's not just about imaginaries. It's not just about exclusion. It's about how the world is built and materialized in these terms between a sound of being and a sound of non-being. So, page 5. So he says, the colonist sector is a sector built to last, all stone and steel. It's a sector of lights and paved roads, where the trash cans constantly overflow with strange and wonderful garbage, undreamed of leftovers. The colonists' feet can never be glimpsed, except perhaps in the sea, but then you can never get close enough. They are protected by solid shoes in a sector where the streets are clean and smooth, without a pothole, without a stone. The colonist sector is sated, is a sated, sluggish sector. Its belly is permanently full of good things. The colonist sector is a white folk sector, a sector of foreigners. The colonized sector, or at least the native quarters, the shanty town, the medina, the reservation, is a disreputable place, inhabited by disreputable people. You are born anywhere, anyhow. You die anywhere from anything. It's a world with no space. People are applied one on top of the other. The shacks squeeze tightly together. The colonized sector is a famished sector, hungry for bread, meat, shoes, coal, and light. The colonized sector is a sector that crouches and cowers, a sector on its knees, a sector that is prostrate. So I find this very telling because what he's describing, like, in very material ways, how this is a very division between a world of what we imagine life and the world of what that we imagine as petrified and death-bound in very material ways. And also how this division actually sustains that idea of life that we have, right? And this lightness and cleanliness of what wide living world means. And he highlights through all this chapter how violence is what governs and sustains the carving of this boundary, right? Or he says explicitly, the violence which governed the ordering of the colonial world, he says. He talks about this compartmentalization also in terms of an affective polarization of forces, or these forces that have constitutive effects and also emerge from the colonial lived world. So how whiteness becomes also like a magnetic force that sort of shapes the building of the world. So what he's talking about here is not merely a classification between white bodies, white colonizer bodies, and native, black, or brown colonized bodies. It's not about that. It's not just a psychic structure or an imaginary or like a cultural classification. He's talking about affective, material, and embodied poles of attachment that or detachment that shape our world, or what we imagine as a living world, and how this also becomes embodied in your own self, as he talked about in Black Skin, White Masks, right? Yeah. So yeah, and how in this sedimentation and this sort of pooling of forces and building of a compartmentalized world, whiteness sort of sediments itself as the law, as what should be, and what should be as living world, right? And instead, both blackness and brownness become the embodiment of what breaks and sustains that law, right? Or the source of evil. And he describes it in this way. He says, the native is declared impervious of ethics, representing not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values, right? So that sector, the colonized sector, and the colonized itself becomes the embodiment of negating ethical values, right? And in this way, he's talking also about how this colonization of the lived world, or the shaping of a colonial lived world, is also a colonization of the space of the ethical, right? Because sort of coloniality is breaking any kind of reciprocity, of imagined reciprocity between any intersubjective relation, because you are not relating with another human anymore. You're not even relating to it because it's completely outside of the ethical space, right? This is the zone of non-being, that he calls. And as I already said, this sort of colonization of the ethical space in these compartmentalized terms is made possible through material violence and the differential distribution of that violence, right? And in this way, he is arguing throughout this chapter that colonial violence and its dehumanization are actually the horizon of intelligibility and possibility of that colonial lived world, right? And in this way, in my interpretation, that same dehumanization and violence are the ground of the meaning of humanity, life, and being in a colonial world, right? So the human subjectivity of the colonizer sort of relies in the production of the colonized as an open wound, as an affectivity that is in constant anticipation of injury and in a sort of permanent muscular tension and anxiety, what he calls petrification. And for this reason, precisely because this shaping this sector of non-being is the condition of possibility of sustaining the sector of being, or the sector of whiteness, is not about complete destruction of that sector, right? It's about a sort of being put on hold, or between life and non-life, in a way that sort of violence becomes banalized and mystified in that space. It sort of no longer appears, right? And he refers to this as a sort of atmospheric kind of violence that permeates everything, but at the same time, you cannot really see it because it becomes banalized. And he describes the space in this way. He talks about a bloody, pitiless atmosphere, the generalization of inhuman practices of people lasting impression that they are witnessing the very apocalypse. And the other way he describes it is from the quote I read before, is that you are born anywhere, anyhow, you die anywhere from anything. It's a world with no space, where people are piled on top of the other. The shacks are squeezed tightly together, right? So this affective disposition of atmospheric violence and generalized violence, that you can no longer even see it, even if you're inside there, because it becomes so generalized, contrasts with the sacralization and the sort of lightness and floating qualities of the life and safety of the human sovereign subject. Since the human zone of non-being is a dystopian space in which there is this absolute banalization of death and pain. So in this space, you are sort of more dead than alive. but you are none of those, right? And he talks about that in this space, everyday life, it's impossible. And for this reason, he talks about the colonized world as a world that is petrified, a world of statues. He talks about that in these terms. Okay. So as I already said, this implies a colonization of the space of the ethical as violence is banalized. And these others are in a space in which they can no longer appear in the space of reciprocity and human relations, right? And human intersubjectivity. So the colonized is pushed outside the realm of ethics, and the space of the ethical is only legitimate in the absence of that dehumanized person, right? This is something that Lewis Gordon points out very clearly in his interpretation of this chapter. So the space of the ethical is only legitimate if the colonized does not appear in there, right? Therefore, any appearance of the colonized in that space of being, it seems violent, right? Is the embodiment of evil and death. So in this sense, any attempt of dismantle that world, but simply appearing in the space of being, is perceived as violent, but within a colonized world, right? So if coloniality is deemed as just because it's overrepresented as the living world, as the human world, the world of justice, then decolonize is to violate this justice, and therefore it will always be violent. Therefore, to dislocate and even imagine a non-colonial world is violent, right? Because it's outside the realm of ethics, outside of the human. And in here, I think what Fanon is trying to say is not that coloniality sort of colonizes life and he tries to liberate it, you know, like that colonization is trying to petrify life, and therefore what we have to try to do is just liberate it so it can be by itself. I think what he's trying to say is that instead we need to redefine what life means in a colonial world, right? What could it mean to be alive outside the terms, outside the wideness that defines that space of being, the space of the ethical, the space of the human, etc. And what I find here is that for him, this redefinition of living amidst a colonial violent world means engaging in what he calls an unending struggle, right? This could be what it means to live and claim life and affirm Black or colonized life within the rims of a colonized world, to engage in an unending struggle to change that world, right? That's what it could mean to live in that world. Not what whiteness tell us that is living, that is not actually living, right? What it could mean to live is to engage in that unending struggle to change that world collectively. So when he talks about dreaming about vitality, dreaming about becoming again a man, he's not trying to say that he wants to be reintegrated into that world. He doesn't want to be recognized as human. He wants to redefine what humanity means, create a new humanity, a new way of thinking about life in this world, precisely because in this colonial lived world, what it means to be human has been captured. right? And this is what Sylvia Wynter takes from him and develops from him in so many ways. Yeah, so he ends this with this quote. He ends the chapter, which for me is very important. He says, "The colossal task, which consists in reintroducing man into the world, man in his totality." So building a new world. And what does that mean, right? And that's it. That's what I prepared for today. I hope it was helpful.
Yes, very helpful. I have questions, but also just anecdotes. So once again, like Giorgi, if you want to pop in with the question real quick, because I know I go on and on.
I don't really have a question, nor a really sophisticated comment, but this idea of creating a new life that really resonated with me, and not just Merleau-Ponty, just a lot of what I try to do in my philosophies is in philosophy when I read philosophy. Most of the times, I find an ethics that I sympathize most with. It's always some sort of ethics of alterity that allows for the creation of new life worlds or the recognition of hitherto subjugated life worlds. And I just wanted to share that and say that because I'm really sympathetic to that, and that was definitely one of the things I was looking for and found in Merleau-Ponty. So just a little comment. That's it.
This zone of being and non-being, I think resonates with me. The way I appear is just dyke deluxe. There's no hiding it. And then growing up in Virginia, working at the Cracker Barrel, there were some incidents that, and a few times, I was violently threatened with a knife, backed into a corner, and this, that, and the other. People really wanting me dead. I'll move up to Philly. I'm in a not that I didn't have friends in Virginia who were more open. We all just collected together, all us others, all us weirdos and freaks and less thans. We can create a community together. And incidents like, "Oh, I need to go to the hospital," or "Oh, I need to do something official at the involving the police or some legal institution." That little world that we've created for ourselves, that little bubble, ooh, it bursts, and we're right back into that world of domineering whiteness, of the colonial old white man. And so I just wonder about that way of like this in between space of, here's this world, we're trying to make a new one. I find many allies. I teach drum lessons in home, and it's with affluent people, because who else can afford to have a drum teacher come into their home? And they are wonderful people, so much love. They know that their children are safe with me. They're getting a good education. We'll chat. We're having a good time. One time, I was out in the front yard talking to one of the moms, and it's not only the dykiness; it's the beat up Toyota. It's the little strings in my clothes where you can see they're about to unravel. That's the adjunct life. I don't care. I'm happy with my accomplishments. But she just straight up yelled, you never seen a woman with a mohawk before? You're fine." And I'm like, "Thanks, lady. That's awesome. I love you so much." But I would not be able to hang out at brunch with her and her friends, because they're in that affluent world together. And while they might be allies and truly want the best for all these people, someone coming from the outside, I'm a little gritty, I've got a wild sense of humor, I'm a little inappropriate, it wouldn't mesh. So then, even in a less extreme manner than what's going on in the ER or what's going on in law institutions, there's that subtle, "I don't belong here and I'm feeling judged." And I think some of those compliments were backhanded. So I feel that violence in a very, subversive way, I guess. And I'm all for it, especially recently. I think for a while I'm like, well, maybe, if we fight in the right ways, we can make these changes within the system, and then we can find some normalcy. And I don't believe that anymore. It's just there's just no, it's gone. Any dream of that happening is gone. So we need to just reconstruct it all. I agree. We need a new definition of humanity. I am partial to Kant's notion of humanity because it is out of humanity that radical evil arises. Like, I can see that. But why do we have a notion of humanity where there's radical evil in there? Why can't our humanity be solely determined by other things? So, what does that in between space look like? Certainly, there will be political violence anytime there needs to be a revolution. But what about the non-physical? Not that I don't feel the judgments, not that there isn't CPTSD built up from all the trauma, but does he give us any insight of what that middle world might look like as we're creating a new humanity?
Hug. So he's very, I interpret this, I always say this, that he sees this as a tragedy. The fact that to change this world, violence is necessary. He's not, how do I say it? He's not advocating for this necessarily. He's not saying like, let's do this, and he's seeing this as tragic. Tragic because how else are you gonna change a world in which, let's put your example with these friends or these people that you were interacting, affluent, are these people really gonna put their livelihoods into the stake for you?
And I wouldn't, and
That's where it lies, because as he says, this sort of lifelessness of the white colonial world is sustained by this violence inflicted towards you, for example. Yeah.
even if it's not.
And then, how you do this, how you dismantle that? Are these people really gonna go by it? Like, are they gonna say yes easily? Like, it's
No.
how?
And like thinking of my little student, I want her to have the best opportunities. Go to the good schools. Like, you have a good heart and a good mind and are open, and we need folks like you in positions of power who can then, revolutionize them. So I don't want them to set aside some of their money to dismantle the system that's allowing them to pursue these greater things. I too would like some money. I'm not trying to be, so rich I don't know what to do with my money, but to be able to not check, just to go to the grocery store, get whatever I need, to travel places and help people when I can. But even then, I'm like, oh, am I still supporting that?
I can't. Yeah. Yeah, that's why I think he says this is tragic. This is not easy. This is tragic. It's sad, and you see it even more when you read the last chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, when he talks about all the cases he treated while he was there, and all the suffering he talks about from colonizers and colonized people, both whites and Algerian people, how deeply colonization caused suffering, and there is no other way out for them. Right? So, yeah.
So a bit of a follow-up question on what was just said. So when Fanon talks about the necessity of violence, so is he open to what we normally call violence, like setting things on fire, or is he excluding that form of violence, or is he saying that just making oneself visible, right, to the colonialist, even in ways that are peaceful at the surface, for the colonialists, they are still violent, right? So just voicing one's pain, right, in the most peaceful way is still violence to the colonizer, right? So my question is, does he allow for all forms of violence, or is he just speaking about this kind of violence?
Yeah, he's talking about something that's happening. He's not being a judge of what's allowed or not. He's talking about what he's living and what's happening in that world, right? So to answer your question, he's describing both because both are happening as he's writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both the violence of burning things, justifiable out of mere anger and out of mere just being completely dehumanized, and also just by being visible, you can be killed or
Of course.
yeah,
Excellent.
right. So I think he's talking about both. He's critical of like pacifism in this situation because he sees it as aiding the reproduction of the same structure that he's criticizing, right? So he is very critical of that in this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, of course. I wasn't implying that he's morally
No,
justifying it. There's the
no,
necessity of
just
it.
like because it is often read like that, like when every time that I try to talk about this text, like I think some people read it in a way that they don't understand that he's writing from the midst of it. Like that's what he's living. He's living amidst all this suffering and violence, and he's talking about things that are happening in that moment. So, and some people read this and criticize him as he's being like a judge of what can be allowed and it cannot be allowed. And he's of course giving his perspective on what he thinks, but he's also describing a moment of decolonization, of thinking about what would it mean to live an anti-colonial world in that moment, right? So
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Excellent. Because that's because now what you're talking about, that's also very interesting, because to be somebody who is in a comfortable enough position, right, to talk neutrally about the subject, and then you say, oh, so he's justifying violence, that precisely sounds like a colonial reading, right?
yeah, and he talks about that position explicitly here, which is the position of the sort of liberal intellectual bourgeoisie that does not understand in the midst of it what does it mean to live in that hell, in that atmosphere of violence. What does it mean? And he talks about that a lot here too.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you.
And it's a shame that they won't know until they live it themselves. And there are certain aspects. I've never been rich, but ever since deciding I'm going to be a drummer and a philosopher in chief, I've reached levels of poverty I did not know existed. And now that I've seen it, I can articulate what's going on. And I was having a conversation with my dad about all these issues I'm having with the landlord, and they're just heinous. They treat people disgustingly. That's a whole nother story. He's like, why do people choose to live there? I'm like, no one has any money to go anywhere else. They do these things to ruin your credit, to steal money from you in little ways, to have awful equipment so that your electric bill is so high that you just can't go anywhere. I just told you I can't afford to go. I can't afford gas. Why? I don't want to live here either. But it's just like, Father, I love with my whole heart. I know you're hearing me. I know you're listening to me tell these stories. I'm just so surprised that you're like, well, why would anybody live there? We got stuck. And I don't want to wish this sort of poverty on anybody. but it's just it is it's a tragedy. What else do you say if you don't want your loved ones to suffer, but you also would like them to understand what you're going through? Right?
Yeah, because as he said, like you live in in another world almost.
Yeah.
And therefore that situation does not register. They can't, it is not understandable. It
Yeah.
does not register as human or as truth or as being, right?
This discussion actually, it's helping me to because I'm like, why am I not being heard? But it's not that they don't want to. It's not that my dad doesn't love me, and that there's no
Right.
that. But it's just it's it's not his fault. It's
No.
just not
Mhm.
anything. There's no evidence for it in his life, and if we're going to be reasonable, we base our conclusions off of
Yeah.
evidence, which is
Right.
it makes sense to him. This is not a criticism of him if he's watching. I love you. I love you, but man, yeah, no questions. But just like I think the term tragedy really is the right term, and that's cathartic to hear, and I think is going to help me cope with whatever this middle world will be. Because as with each passing day, I just and not that I'm becoming angrier and angrier, but I'm giving fewer and fewer fucks, and it's just coming out of my mouth, whatever it is.
Right. Anger, justifiable anger, and
So
wish
as
to burn, like to
yeah,
rebuild. And you said, yeah,
yeah.
I understand. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
that's exactly what I was thinking when you were bringing the examples from your experience with the doctors, because I think we need more of that in philosophy, because I think we can get a little more radical, and go from, let's say, Husserl, Merleau-Ponty to Fanon and Foucault, and say, there are moments of justified moments when you should probably weaponize your life world to survive, and
Mm.
facilitate a kind of eruption of your life world into the life world of the oppressor.
Right.
oh
Hmm.
yeah, down.
Yeah. Now that with this said, I do think that he has a bit of a very gendered vision on political action, though. Like, um, he's very masculine, the kind of political action that he is describing here. And so that's another thing to explore in his thought. This kind of violent expression of political action as, like, like being like violent and rupturing things, like that's very masculine. And I don't know, maybe there are other feminist visions of what political action could be, and that are maybe not in this way. I don't know.
Yeah, there seems to be a kind of compromise with power there, right?
Yeah.
A negotiation with uh, another discourse that is not inherently liberating, but that there seems to be a negotiation with it, which allows him to empower himself for his cause, and that's familiar to me, because I like to listen to certain forms of art that comes from Black resistance, and it's radical and leftist and political, and I noticed that it's very good for its own purpose, but there's this compromise with masculinity, there's this compromise with misogyny, that is
Yeah, for
nonetheless
sure. Yeah.
unacceptable.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I do think that this is like a blind spot in his own exploration of his own lived experience, his gendered being, and how he talks about women and all these things. Like, you can see, but it's of course like how not to, who can see all their flaws or how their lived experience is completely shaped in this structure of power. It's impossible, right?
of course, of course.
So yeah. Mm.
Mm. Mm-mm-mm. Oh, um, I'm exhausted of anything else other than further anecdotes that could just keep going and going and going and going. Um, This has been a wonderful presentation. Both of you, thank you so much. And again, this topic is timely, and so I appreciate the passion and enthusiasm that you both have brought. Not that you all haven't brought that in Chop's past. It's really palpable today, and it's really empowering to be here with you all. So thank you.
I
Thank you,
do want
Keli.
to say that I really appreciated your rage as you were reading, and like I think we need more of this when we read philosophy. Good.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Keli, and once again for hosting this because, like I said before, I've been a little ostracized from academia and having difficulties going back in, so I don't have a lot of opportunity to talk about what I'm really interested in, what I'm passionate about, and these really keep me going. So thank you.
No, I feel that.
Same here.
Yeah, we're all little misfits, I guess. I've got my adjuncting position that I'll cling to just to say, yeah, I'm legitimate. I am a real professor. But I feel that ostracism because I am poor, because I look different. I came from the South, and when I first showed up, had an accent, because I am neurodivergent and don't pick up on social hierarchies. And even if I did, then I would mouth off, and then I mouth off, and it's just
Yeah.
I feel that, and that's what this space is for, to be doing true intellectual work where, as much as we possibly can, release the fetters of elitism and bigotry and certain formalities that just aren't necessary. Other ways to explore other ways of doing philosophy, to really challenge ideas in a way that the ivory tower would not accept. Um, yeah, I'm happy you all are here.
Thank you. This has always been a very good space also for me because I do almost everything online, so I don't have space to talk about with other intellectuals about these things. So I really appreciate this. Thank you so much, Keli.
All right, well, we'll conclude for today. Let me stop recording. Goodbye, everyone. In the meanwhile, see you next year.